Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time my hammer disappeared, I blamed the chaos of renovation. Tools have a way of wandering in old houses, swallowed by shadows between exposed joists, or kicked behind paint cans by careless feet. But when I found it 3 days later, balanced perfectly on the kitchen windowsill with a coating of fine yellow dust that smelled like old paper and something else, something organic and stale, I knew this house was playing games with me. The 1940s colonial had been a steal, even by today's inflated market standards. The realtor's nervous laugh when I'd asked about the price should have been warning enough, but I was desperate to escape my cramped apartment and the memories it held. The previous owner had died of natural causes, she'd assured me, though she'd avoided eye contact when saying it. Natural causes in a house that creaked like arthritic bones and held shadows in corners where shadows shouldn't exist. I'd been living in the renovated first floor for 2 weeks when the hammering started. It began as a distant tapping, rhythmic and purposeful, always seeming to come from directly above whatever room I occupied. At first, I convinced myself it was the house settling, or perhaps pipes expanding in the October heat. But settling doesn't maintain perfect tempo, and pipes don't tap out what sounded suspiciously like Morse code patterns. The sound followed me through my daily routine with uncanny precision. When I stood in the kitchen making coffee, the tapping echoed from the ceiling directly overhead. When I moved to the living room to review blueprints, the sound migrated with me, staying centered above my position like a spotlight of noise. It was as if something was tracking my movements from above, marking my presence with that steady, methodical hammering. My sleep grew restless. The tapping would wake me at exactly 3:17 a.m., continuing for precisely 11 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it began. I started keeping a log, noting the consistency that felt too deliberate to be coincidental. The pattern never varied. 11 taps in rapid succession, followed by a pause of exactly 7 seconds, then repeated. After 11 minutes, silence would return, leaving me staring at the ceiling until dawn. Tools continued to vanish with increasing frequency. My level disappeared from the basement workshop and reappeared in the upstairs hallway, covered in that same yellow dust. A screwdriver I'd set down for mere seconds was gone, only to surface days later in the refrigerator, nestled between the milk and leftover takeout like it belonged there. Each time, that peculiar dust clung to the metal, and each time, the smell grew stronger, mustier, more oppressive, carrying hints of something decomposing. The yellow substance defied explanation. It wasn't sawdust or plaster dust from the renovation work. Under close examination, it appeared almost crystalline, with tiny particles that caught light strangely, creating brief prismatic flashes that hurt to look at directly. When I tried to sweep it up, it seemed to dissipate into the air rather than collect in the dustpan, leaving only the lingering smell and a faint tingling sensation on my skin. By the 3rd week, I'd exhausted rational explanations. The house's original blueprints showed nothing unusual, standard room layouts with no indication of hidden spaces or unusual architectural features. Yet the hammering persisted, and my certainty that someone or something was moving through unseen areas above me grew stronger with each passing day. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening as I was installing new light fixtures in the 2nd floor hallway. The hammering had been particularly active, seeming to pace back and forth overhead with an urgency I hadn't experienced before. Instead of trying to ignore it, I decided to follow the sound. I traced the noise to the hallway's far end, where an ornate molding ran along the ceiling's edge. The hammering was directly above, so close it seemed I could reach up and touch its source. I fetched my stepladder and began examining the ceiling more closely, running my hands along the plaster surface, searching for any irregularities. That's when I found it, a section of molding that wasn't quite flush with the wall. When I pressed against it, the entire piece shifted slightly, revealing itself to be a cleverly disguised access panel. The hammering stopped the moment my fingers touched the hidden mechanism, as if whatever was above knew it had been discovered. The panel opened on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow opening that led into darkness. Cool air flowed down, carrying that familiar yellow dust and a smell that made my stomach clench. The odor of a space that had been sealed away from the world for decades. I could hear something moving in the darkness above, a shifting, rustling sound like fabric being dragged across wooden floors. My flashlight beam revealed a crawl space that extended farther than the house's exterior dimensions should have allowed. The space was larger than any typical attic access, with enough headroom for someone to stand comfortably. And it wasn't empty. The first thing I saw were the toys. Dozens of them, scattered across the dusty floorboards like abandoned playthings in a nursery. But these weren't modern toys. They were antiques, wind-up figures from the 1940s and 1950s, their paint faded and metal bodies tarnished with age. A tin soldier with a missing arm stood at attention near my feet. A mechanical monkey clutched faded cymbals in its tiny hands. A ballerina in a tattered tutu was frozen mid-pirouette, her painted smile chipped and sinister in the flashlight's harsh beam. What made my breath catch wasn't their presence, but their positioning. They were arranged in a rough circle, all facing inward toward the room's center, as if they'd been set up to observe something, or someone. As I climbed into the space, my flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing newspaper clippings and photographs tacked to the exposed beams. The papers were yellowed with age, their headlines speaking of wartime rationing and victory gardens, of local boys shipped overseas and Gold Star mothers. The photographs showed families in formal poses, children with serious expressions, adults with the stoic bearing common to that era. But it was the mirror that stopped me cold. It dominated the far wall, an enormous antique piece with an ornate silver frame that reflected my flashlight beam in fractured patterns across the ceiling. The glass was old, with the slight warping and imperfections that spoke of handcrafted manufacture. Dark spots had formed along the edges where the silvering had deteriorated, creating pools of shadow within the reflection. I approached it slowly, noting how my footsteps seemed to echo strangely in the enclosed space, as if the sound was being repeated from somewhere else. When I stood directly in front of the mirror, my reflection looked back at me with what should have been perfect synchronization. But it wasn't perfect. The delay was subtle at first, maybe half a second between my movement and my reflection's response. When I raised my hand, my mirrored image seemed to consider the action before slowly lifting its own hand in response. When I tilted my head, the reflection paused before mimicking the gesture, like someone watching and learning my movements before copying them. I stepped back, convinced I was imagining things, but the delay became more pronounced. My reflection was now a full second behind, moving with deliberate intention rather than automatic mimicry. It was as if someone else was controlling my mirrored image, studying my actions and approximating them with increasing inaccuracy. The worst part was the expression. While I stared in growing horror, my reflection wore a slight smile that I wasn't making. Its eyes held the intelligence that felt separate from my own, a consciousness that was watching me as intently as I was watching it. I turned away from the mirror, and that's when I heard the first toy move. The mechanical monkey had lifted its tiny cymbals, bringing them together in a soft, metallic whisper that seemed deafeningly loud in the confined space. As I watched, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing, the tin soldier's remaining arm began to move, raising and lowering in a rigid salute. The ballerina started to spin, her tutu rustling with a sound like autumn leaves. One by one, the toys came to life around me, their clockwork mechanisms somehow functioning despite decades of neglect. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if invisible hands were winding their springs and setting them in motion. The air filled with the soft clicking and whirring of gears, punctuated by the monkey's rhythmic cymbals and the soldier's mechanical marching sounds. But they weren't moving randomly. As impossible as it seemed, the toys were performing in unison, creating a choreographed display that felt like a greeting or a warning. They were welcoming me to their hidden space, acknowledging my presence in a way that made my skin crawl with primitive terror. I backed toward the opening, my rational mind screaming that wind-up toys couldn't function without being wound, that mirrors couldn't delay reflections. that the hammering sound I'd been hearing was probably just settling or thermal expansion. But my instincts overruled logic, flooding my system with adrenaline and the overwhelming need to escape. As I reached the opening, I made the mistake of glancing back at the mirror one final time. My reflection was still there, but now it was doing something I wasn't doing. It was waving goodbye, its smile wider and more knowing than before. In the silvered surface, I could see the toys continuing their macabre performance, dancing and marching and spinning in celebration of something I couldn't understand. I fell more than climbed down from the crawl space, my hands shaking as I fumbled to close the access panel. The moment it clicked shut, the silence was absolute. No more hammering, no more mechanical sounds, just the ordinary creaks and sighs of an old house at rest. But the silence felt wrong now, pregnant with presence and watching eyes. I could feel something observing me from above, tracking my movements through the ceiling as I stumbled down the hallway to my temporary bedroom on the first floor. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that reflection smile and wave, heard the whisper of cymbals and the click of clockwork mechanisms. Over the following days, I tried to convince myself that exhaustion and stress had caused hallucinations. The renovation had been overwhelming, I reasoned, and old houses were full of optical illusions and acoustic tricks. But the tools kept disappearing, always returning covered in that yellow dust that now seemed to sparkle with malevolent intent. The hammering resumed, but with a different quality now. It was more insistent, more urgent, as if whatever was above was trying to communicate something important. The rhythm had changed too. Instead of the Morse code patterns, it now seemed to be mimicking the sounds I made throughout the day. When I hammered nails into the wall, the ceiling would echo the same number of strikes. When I dropped something heavy, the response would come within seconds, perfectly duplicating the sound. I started to test this phenomenon, creating deliberate noises to see if they would be copied. 3 sharp knocks on the table would produce 3 answering knocks from above. A pencil tapped against a window would be followed by identical tapping sounds from the ceiling. Whatever was up there was listening, learning, responding with an intelligence that defied every rational explanation I could construct. The worst part was the growing certainty that it wasn't just copying my sounds. It was trying to get my attention, trying to draw me back to that hidden space where toys moved without being wound, and mirrors showed reflections with their own agenda. I began avoiding the second floor entirely, conducting all my work on the ground level and sleeping in the living room rather than venture upstairs. But the presence followed me, manifesting in peripheral glimpses and half-heard whispers that could have been wind or imagination. Tools continued to vanish, sometimes reappearing in impossible locations. Inside locked drawers I knew I hadn't opened, balanced on shelves too high to reach without a ladder. The yellow dust was everywhere now, coating surfaces that should have been clean, accumulating in corners despite my constant cleaning efforts. It had a way of appearing overnight, as if something was systematically distributing it throughout the house while I slept. The smell was stronger too, that organic, decomposing odor that made me gag when it was particularly concentrated. 3 weeks after discovering the hidden room, I made a decision that would haunt me far more than any supernatural presence could. I decided to sell the house and leave, to walk away from the renovation and the increasingly bizarre experiences that accompanied it. But first, I needed to document what I'd found, to have some record of the crawl space and its impossible contents. I climbed back into the hidden room with a camera, determined to capture evidence of the toys and the strange mirror. But when I reached the space, everything had changed. The toys were gone, leaving only faint impressions in the dust where they had been arranged. The newspaper clippings and photographs had been removed from the walls, leaving behind tiny tack holes and rectangles of darker wood where they had hung. Even the yellow dust seemed diminished, as if whatever had been generating it had moved on to other pursuits. Only the mirror remained, dominating the far wall with its ornate frame and warped glass. And when I looked into it, hoping to capture the delayed reflection on camera, I saw only my own face staring back with perfect synchronization. But as I lowered the camera and turned to leave, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a glimpse of movement in the mirror's surface that didn't correspond to any motion I was making. When I spun back to look directly, the reflection was normal again, matching my movements with mechanical precision. The camera's memory card was blank when I tried to review the photos later, not corrupted or damaged, completely empty, as if I had never taken any pictures at all. The device functioned normally when I tested it on other subjects, but any image captured in that hidden space simply vanished, leaving no digital trace of what I had experienced. I put the house on the market the next day, pricing it aggressively low to ensure a quick sale. The realtor, a different one from the woman who had sold it to me, asked about the reason for the sudden departure. I told her about unexpected job relocation, avoiding any mention of hammering sounds or moving toys or mirrors that reflected delayed images. But as I packed my belongings for the move, I discovered something that turned my growing anxiety into full-blown terror. In the back of my bedroom closet, wrapped in a towel I didn't recognize, I found one of the wind-up toys from the hidden room. It was the mechanical monkey with the tiny symbols, its paint faded and metal body covered in that familiar yellow dust. A note was attached to its base, written in spidery handwriting that could have been decades old. "Thank you for visiting. Don't forget us." The toy's clockwork mechanism was wound tight, as if someone had just turned the key moments before I found it. When I set it on the floor, it began to move immediately, clashing its symbols together in that soft, metallic rhythm I remembered from the crawl space. It performed for exactly 11 minutes before winding down to stillness, the same duration as the hammering episodes that had first alerted me to the hidden room's existence. I packed the toy carefully in a box with my other possessions, unsure why I didn't simply throw it away. Perhaps I needed the physical evidence, some proof that the experiences had been real rather than stress-induced hallucinations. Or perhaps something else was influencing my decision, some compulsion I couldn't quite identify. The new owners moved in 2 weeks after I left. I heard from the realtor that they were delighted with the house, particularly impressed by the quality of the renovation work I had completed. They had found some old toys in the attic, she mentioned casually during our final phone conversation. Antique pieces that the previous owner must have left behind. They planned to display them in their child's room as decorative vintage pieces. I wanted to warn them, to explain about the yellow dust and the delayed reflections and the impossible sounds that followed you through the house like a presence seeking acknowledgement. But how do you tell someone that their dream home might be sharing space with something that exists in the margins between reality and imagination? How do you explain experiences that you yourself can't fully believe or understand? The mechanical monkey sits on my mantelpiece now, in my new apartment across town. It hasn't moved since that day in the closet, despite my occasional temptation to wind its mechanism and watch it perform. Sometimes in the early morning hours when sleep eludes me, I hear faint hammering sounds from the apartment above. But my upstairs neighbor is an elderly woman who couldn't possibly be doing construction work, and the sounds always stop when I get up to investigate. The yellow dust appears sometimes too, just a light coating on surfaces that should be clean, carrying that same organic smell and the same prismatic sparkle that catches light in ways that hurt to observe directly. I've learned to clean it up without thinking too hard about its source or significance. But the real terror isn't in the paranormal manifestations or the impossible experiences that followed me from the house. It's in the growing certainty that I'm being watched, observed, studied by something that exists just outside the boundaries of normal perception. Something that learned my patterns in that hidden room and now follows me through my daily life, mimicking my movements and responding to my sounds with an intelligence that feels increasingly familiar. Sometimes when I catch my reflection in windows or mirrors, I notice a slight delay before my image responds. It's subtle, barely perceptible, but it's there. That half-second pause that suggests someone else is controlling my reflection. Someone who remembers my visit to their space and wants to maintain contact. I've stopped looking in mirrors when I can avoid it. I've stopped making unnecessary sounds that might be copied and returned. I've learned to live with the presence that shadows my existence, following me from room to room like a curious pet that never shows itself directly. The worst part is the growing suspicion that it's not malevolent. It's lonely. Whatever exists in that hidden space between walls and beneath floors and behind mirrors, It simply wants acknowledgement, wants to be remembered and included in the world of the living. The toys were gifts, the copied sounds were attempts at communication, the delayed reflections were efforts to establish connection with someone who had finally found their hiding place. But understanding its motivation doesn't make the experience less terrifying. If anything, the knowledge that I'm being courted by something that exists outside normal reality makes every day a careful navigation between acknowledgement and ignorance, between acceptance and denial. The mechanical monkey watches me from its place on the mantelpiece, its painted eyes reflecting light in ways that suggest awareness. Sometimes I think I see its tiny symbols twitch, as if it's preparing to resume its performance. But it remains still, waiting for some signal I hope I never accidentally provide. Because I'm beginning to understand that my visit to the hidden room wasn't a discovery, it was an invitation. And the presence that followed me home isn't a haunting, it's a courtship. Something is trying to establish a relationship with me, using the only methods it knows, in the only ways it can manifest in our world. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't whether the experiences were real or imagined. It's whether I'm strong enough to keep resisting the invitation, or if I'll eventually give in to the curiosity and loneliness that draws me toward that mirror world existence where reflections have their own agenda and toys move with borrowed life. The hammering has started again, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere within my apartment's walls. It maintains that familiar rhythm, 11 taps followed by 7 seconds of silence, repeated for exactly 11 minutes before stopping. But now it feels like a greeting, a reminder that I'm not alone, that something remembers our meeting and wants to continue the conversation we started in that hidden room above the house I fled. I've learned to ignore it, to pretend I don't hear the sounds, or notice the yellow dust, or see the delayed movements in reflective surfaces. But ignoring something and making it disappear are two very different things, and I'm beginning to suspect that some invitations, once extended, can never be fully declined. The mechanical monkey continues its vigil from the mantelpiece, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when my resistance finally crumbles, and I wind its key to hear its metallic song once more. When that happens, and I fear it's becoming a question of when rather than if, I suspect my relationship with reality will change in ways I'm not prepared to understand. Until then, I live in the space between acknowledgement and denial, never quite sure if the presence that shadows my existence is real or imagined, but certain that it's not going away. And perhaps that uncertainty, that constant questioning of what's possible and what's simply the product of a mind pushed beyond its limits, is exactly where it wants me to be. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of my experience isn't the supernatural manifestations or the impossible physics of delayed reflections. It's the growing realization that I may never know for certain what was real and what was the product of isolation and stress, and an old house's ability to play tricks on the senses. The doubt is the real horror, the knowledge that I'll spend the rest of my life questioning every reflection, every unexplained sound, every tool that isn't exactly where I left it. Because once you've seen a mirror that shows what it wants to show rather than what should be there, once you've heard toys move without being wound, once you've felt the presence of something that exists in the spaces between what's possible and what's real, you can never quite trust your own perceptions again, and maybe that's exactly what it wanted all along. Story 2. The advertisement had been almost apologetic. Last room available. 3rd floor. Quiet tenant preferred. What it hadn't mentioned was the smell. That peculiar mixture of old wood, mothballs, and something earthier that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Mrs. Caldwell, the landlady, had led me up the narrow staircase with the resigned air of someone who'd grown accustomed to disappointment. "Most people don't stay long," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper, as we climbed past the 2nd floor landing. The room's particular. I should have asked what she meant, but desperation makes you overlook red flags. 3 months behind on rent at my previous place, eviction notice crumpled in my jacket pocket. I would have taken a closet if it came with 4 walls and a roof. The boarding house on Elm Street wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it was within my budget. Barely. The room sat directly beneath the attic, its sloped ceiling following the roof line. A single window faced east, overlooking what Mrs. Caldwell had described as the old grounds. Through the glass, I could see the crumbling stone wall that separated the property from the abandoned Greenwood Cemetery. The headstones beyond were weathered and tilted, like broken teeth in an ancient mouth. "Cemetery's been closed for 40 years, Mrs. Caldwell had explained, following my gaze. "City ran out of space. Nobody gets buried there anymore." That first night, I'd arranged my few possessions with the methodical precision of someone trying to impose order on chaos. The narrow bed against the far wall, my clothes in the warped dresser, my laptop on the small desk beneath the window. I'd always been particular about security, so I'd tested the door lock twice, turning the key until it clicked decisively into place. Old habits from a childhood spent in questionable neighborhoods. Sleep came surprisingly easily that first night, aided by exhaustion and the relief of having a roof over my head. But somewhere in the depths of unconsciousness, I became aware of sounds. Soft, scratching noises that seemed to emanate from directly above my head. In my dream, I convinced myself it was mice or settling wood. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows that. I woke to sunlight streaming through the open window. The open window. I sat up, disoriented, staring at the glass that had definitely been closed and latched when I'd gone to bed. A cool morning breeze ruffled the thin curtains, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and immediately felt something gritty beneath my bare feet. Dirt. Dark, moist soil scattered across the hardwood floor in a trail that led from the window to my bed and back again. Not the fine dust that accumulates in old buildings, but rich earth, the kind you'd find in a garden or a graveyard. I spent 20 minutes cleaning it up, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the window latch was broken. Maybe I'd tracked dirt in on my shoes without noticing. Maybe the wind had blown soil through the screen. Except there was no screen, I realized, peering at the naked window frame. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't anywhere to be found when I went downstairs, and the other tenants, a middle-aged woman named Joyce and an elderly man called Mr. Henderson, both avoided eye contact when I asked about the window. Joyce had mumbled something about settling for the night and hurried past. Mr. Henderson had simply shrugged and suggested I speak to the landlady. The second night, I made sure to not only lock the door, but also to prop a chair against it. I checked the window latch 3 times, even going so far as to place a small piece of tape across the frame. If someone was playing pranks, they'd have to break the seal. The scratching started around midnight. This time I was awake to hear it. A soft, rhythmic scraping that seemed to move across the ceiling from one end of the room to the other. Not mice. Too deliberate, too purposeful. It sounded almost like fingernails against wood, or perhaps feet, many feet scurrying back and forth above my head. I lay perfectly still, tracking the sound as it traveled from the window side wall to the door and back again. The pattern was oddly frantic, as if whatever was up there was searching for something, or trying to escape. The sound stopped abruptly at dawn. When I opened my eyes, weak sunlight was again filtering through the open window. The tape lay torn on the floor, and my bare feet found more dirt, this time in distinct footprints that traced a path around my bed. The prints were small, narrow, and undeniably human. I spent the day at the library using their Wi-Fi to search for information about the boarding house and the cemetery beyond. What I found made my skin crawl. Greenwood Cemetery had indeed been closed for 40 years, but not just due to lack of space. In 1985, there had been an incident. A section of the old cemetery wall had collapsed during a severe storm, damaging several graves. The article I found was frustratingly vague, mentioning only that remains had been disturbed, and that the city had decided to relocate the affected graves to a larger cemetery across town. But relocations cost money, and bureaucracy moves slowly. A follow-up article from 6 months later mentioned that the relocation project had been indefinitely delayed due to budget constraints. There was no mention of it ever being completed. That evening, I confronted Mrs. Caldwell directly, I found her in the kitchen, hunched over a cup of tea that steamed like incense in the dim light. "The window keeps opening," I said without preamble. "And there's dirt. Every morning." She didn't look up from her cup. "Sometimes the latch sticks. Old house, you understand." "What about the cemetery? What happened with the relocations?" Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips. "That's not your concern." "It is if it's affecting my sleep. There are sounds. Footprints." She set the cup down with a sharp clink. "Mr. Patterson, I rent rooms, not explanations. If you're not satisfied with the accommodations, you're free to leave." But I wasn't free to leave, and we both knew it. I had nowhere else to go. The third night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I positioned myself in the chair by the window, armed with a flashlight and my phone camera. If something was happening, I was going to document it. The scratching began precisely at midnight, as if summoned by the turning of some cosmic clock. This time, however, I could hear something else beneath the sound, a low rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from the cemetery beyond my window. I pressed my face to the glass and peered into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in stark silver and black. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar silhouettes of weathered headstones and overgrown grass. Then I noticed the movement, shadows that seemed to shift independently of the swaying trees. Dark figures that appeared to glide between the graves, sometimes pausing at particular spots as if conducting some sort of search. I counted at least a dozen, though it was difficult to be certain in the shifting moonlight. I grabbed my phone and aimed it at the window, but the screen showed only darkness. Either the camera couldn't pick up what I was seeing, or the thought was too disturbing to complete. Above my head, the scratching grew more frantic, more desperate. It sounded like clawing now, as if something was trying to dig its way through the ceiling. I aimed my flashlight upward and saw something that made my blood freeze. The paint on the ceiling was scored with long, parallel scratches that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Fresh wood showed through in places, as if someone, or something, had been dragging sharp objects across the surface. I must have made some sound of shock, because the scratching stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was even worse than the noise had been. I sat frozen, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard the soft creak of my door opening. The chair I'd propped against it hadn't moved. The lock I'd turned 3 times was still engaged. But the door was definitely, unmistakably opening with the slow deliberation of someone trying not to be heard. I spun the flashlight toward the entrance and saw nothing. The door stood ajar, revealing only the dark hallway beyond. But as I watched, paralyzed with terror, I could see the gap widening inch by inch, as if invisible hands were pulling it open from the other side. The beam of my flashlight began to flicker and dim. I shook the device frantically, but the light continued to fade until I was plunged into absolute darkness. In that blackness, I heard them enter. Soft footsteps, multiple sets, padding across my floor with the careful gait of those trying not to disturb the living. I could hear the rustle of fabric, the whisper of movement, the almost inaudible sound of breathing that wasn't quite right. Too shallow, too slow. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there in my chair while unknown figures moved through my room. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if fear had severed the connection between my brain and my muscles. The footsteps circled my chair. I could feel them passing inches from my face, could smell that distinctive odor of earth and decay that I'd been noticing since my first night. Something brushed against my shoulder, fabric, or perhaps skin that was unnaturally cold. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the presence withdrew. I heard the soft padding of feet moving toward the window, the whisper of movement, and finally, silence. When my flashlight finally flickered back to life, I was alone. The door was closed and locked. The window was shut tight, but the floor around my chair was covered in muddy footprints, dozens of them, in sizes ranging from adult to child, all pointing toward the cemetery wall. I didn't sleep for the remainder of that night. Instead, I sat in my chair until dawn, watching the window and trying to convince myself that stress and isolation had finally taken their toll on my sanity. Hallucinations were a documented symptom of severe anxiety and sleep deprivation. That had to be the explanation. But when morning came and I opened the window to let in fresh air, I found something that shattered my rational explanations entirely. Scratched into the outer windowsill, letters carved deep into the old wood with what must have been fingernails or some similar tool, was a single word: help. The carving was fresh. The wood was still pale where it had been gouged, and tiny splinters clung to the edges of each letter. This wasn't some old marking I'd simply failed to notice. Someone, or something, had carved this message during the night, from outside my third-floor window. I spent the morning walking through the cemetery, though the main gate had been chained shut for years, and I had to climb over a low section of the wall to get inside. The place was a maze of crumbling monuments and sinking graves. Many of the headstones had fallen or tilted at odd angles, and the ground itself seemed unstable, as if it had been disturbed and never properly resettled. Near the section closest to the boarding house, I found what I was looking for: a cluster of graves where the earth had clearly been excavated and then hastily refilled. The soil was loose and dark, different from the packed clay that covered the rest of the cemetery. Some of the graves had no markers at all, just rectangular depressions in the ground that suggested hasty temporary interment. This was where they'd moved the remains from the collapsed wall section 40 years ago. Not to another cemetery, but to whatever space they could find within Greenwood itself. A quick, cheap solution to a bureaucratic problem. But the graves had been dug too shallow, the soil hadn't been properly prepared, and over the decades the ground had settled unevenly. Some of the caskets had probably shifted, or worse, deteriorated enough that their contents had become mobile. I was still trying to process this possibility when I noticed the holes. Small openings scattered throughout the disturbed section, each about the size of a person's fist. They appeared to be burrowed from below, as if something underground had been digging its way to the surface. The earth around each hole was freshly turned, still moist from recent activity. That's when I understood what I'd been hearing in my ceiling. The boarding house shared a wall with the cemetery, and something, multiple somethings, had been tunneling through the soft earth, following the stone foundation of the building, climbing through gaps in the old masonry to reach the spaces between walls. They were looking for a way out, a way back to the surface world they'd been forced to leave 4 decades ago. And my room, positioned directly above their underground passages, had become their primary point of access. I spent that 4th day researching the legal requirements for grave relocation, the proper depth for burial, the decomposition rates of different casket materials. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the Greenwood relocations had been botched from the beginning. Corners had been cut, procedures ignored, and the dead had been left in limbo, too close to the surface, too far from proper rest. That night, I didn't even pretend to try sleeping. Instead, I sat by the window with my laptop open, documenting everything I'd experienced and discovered. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record. The activity began earlier than usual. Around 11 o'clock, I heard the first tentative scratches above my head. But this time, the sounds seemed different, less frantic, more purposeful, as if whatever was up there had finally figured out what it was looking for. The window opened by itself at 11:47 p.m. I watched it happen, saw the latch turn and the glass swing outward without any visible cause. A cold breeze swept into the room, carrying with it that familiar scent of earth and decay. But now I could detect something else underneath it, the faint, sweet smell of flowers long since withered. The scratching in the ceiling changed to a more rhythmic pattern, almost like Morse code. 3 short scratches, 3 long ones, 3 short again. SOS. I grabbed my phone and texted Mrs. Caldwell. Need to talk. Emergency. Her response came immediately, as if she'd been waiting. Some things can't be fixed. Some debts can't be paid. Before I could reply, my phone died. The screen went black, and no amount of pressing the power button would revive it. That's when I heard my door creak open again. This time, I was ready. I spun toward the sound with my flashlight raised, determined to see whatever was entering my room. The beam illuminated the doorway just as the first figure stepped through. It was a woman in a faded dress that might once have been blue but had turned the color of old bones. Her hair hung in limp strands around a face that was too pale, too sharp, as if the flesh had shrunk back from the skull beneath. She moved with the careful, hesitant steps of someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Behind her came others. Men, women, elderly people moving with that same peculiar gait. Their clothes were outdated, formal. Burial clothes, I realized with a chill. Some appeared more solid than others, as if they were still learning how to manifest in the world above ground. They filled my small room, standing shoulder to shoulder around my chair. None of them looked directly at me, but I could feel their attention like a weight pressing down on my chest. They seemed to be waiting for something. Then the woman in the blue dress spoke, her voice like wind through dry leaves. 40 years we've been calling. 40 years trapped between earth and air, neither buried nor free. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What do you want? To rest, she said simply. To be properly laid to rest, as was promised and never delivered. I don't have the authority. You have a voice, another figure said, this one an elderly man in a suit that had probably been expensive once. You have connections to the world above. You can tell our story. I looked around at the assembled figures, at their expectant faces and desperate eyes. Why me? Why my room? Because you stayed, the woman replied. Others fled after the first night, or the second. You remained. You listened. You tried to understand. We tried to communicate gently, the elderly man added. But the living rarely pay attention to subtle signs. We had to become more insistent. The dirt, the footprints, the scratched message on the windowsill. They hadn't been trying to frighten me. They'd been trying to get my attention, to make me investigate, to help me understand their situation. What happened to the relocation project? I asked. The woman's expression grew bitter. Bureaucracy and greed. The city allocated funds, but the contractors cut corners. We were moved from one inadequate grave to another, buried too shallow, without proper ceremony or respect. The dead have rights too, but ours were ignored. Some of us have been displaced multiple times, another voice added. Moved from grave to grave as the ground shifted and settled improperly. We haven't known peace in 40 years. I stared at them. These displaced souls who had been trapped between worlds by human negligence and indifference. What can I do? Contact the authorities. Tell them what you've discovered. Force them to complete what they began. Who's going to believe me? I'm just a guy renting a room. I have no credibility, no connections. You have proof, the woman said, gesturing toward my laptop. You've documented everything. You've photographed the disturbed graves, researched the failed relocation project. You have evidence of negligence. She was right. Over the past 4 days, I'd assembled a comprehensive record of the city's failure to properly handle the Greenwood relocations. With the right presentation, it might be enough to force action. If I do this, I said slowly, if I contact the media, the city officials, the right people, will you leave me alone? The assembled figures exchanged glances. The woman nodded. We will rest when we are properly buried. Until then, we must continue to seek help wherever we can find it. But others will come, the elderly man added. Others will rent this room, experience what you've experienced. The cycle will continue until someone takes action. I looked around at their expectant faces, at the desperate hope in their eyes, and realized I didn't really have a choice. These people had been wronged, abandoned, forgotten. If I walked away now, if I let someone else deal with the problem, I'd be just as complicit as the officials who had failed them 40 years ago. I'll do it, I said. I'll tell your story. The relief that washed over their faces was almost palpable. One by one, they began to fade, becoming translucent and then invisible. The woman in the blue dress was the last to go. Thank you, she whispered, and then she was gone. I spent the rest of the night awake, organizing my research and preparing my case. By morning, I had contacted 3 local news stations, the city health department, and a lawyer who specialized in municipal negligence cases. The story broke 2 days later. Within a week, the city had announced a full investigation into the Greenwood relocations. Within a month, they'd allocated funds for proper reinterment in consecrated ground at the new municipal cemetery. The process would take time. Bureaucracy always does. But it would be done correctly this time, with respect and dignity. I stayed in the room throughout the investigation, serving as a witness and consultant. The activity in my ceiling gradually diminished as word spread through whatever network the displaced dead used to communicate. The last disturbance was 3 weeks after my encounter with the woman in blue. A single, soft tap above my head that sounded almost like, "Thank you." The window has stayed closed since then. The dirt has disappeared. I sleep peacefully now, knowing that I've kept my promise. But sometimes, in the hours just before dawn, I wonder if what I experienced was real, or if the stress and isolation of my situation had finally pushed me past the breaking point. Maybe the whole thing was an elaborate hallucination brought on by anxiety and sleep deprivation. Maybe I created an entire supernatural scenario to cope with the guilt of living above an abandoned cemetery. The relocations are real. The news coverage proves that. The official investigation documented the negligent burial practices, the shallow graves, the bureaucratic failures. The city is paying millions to correct 40 years of indifference. But was I really visited by the dead? Or did I simply piece together publicly available information and convince myself I was being guided by supernatural forces? I'll never know for certain. What I do know is that 47 people who had been denied proper rest for 4 decades are finally being laid to rest with dignity, whether they asked for my help directly or whether my guilt and empathy led me to advocate for them doesn't really matter. The important thing is that their story is being told. The important thing is that someone finally listened. Story 3. The wind had been screaming for 3 days straight. I pressed my face against the frost-covered window of the converted warehouse, watching the Patagonian storm rage across the endless steppes. The glass felt like ice against my cheek, and my breath fogged the surface in irregular patches. Behind me, the makeshift hostel buzzed with the nervous energy of stranded travelers, backpackers from Germany, a couple of Australian hitchhikers, and a silent man from Buenos Aires who kept to himself in the corner bunk. The building itself seemed to groan under the assault of wind and snow. Originally a sheep shearing facility, someone had converted it into budget accommodation by cramming metal bunk beds into every available space. The ceiling stretched high above us, supported by rusted beams that creaked ominously with each gust. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows that danced across the concrete walls. I'd been traveling alone through Patagonia for 2 weeks, seeking something I couldn't quite name. Solitude, maybe, or clarity. The kind of perspective that only comes from stripping away civilization's comfortable layers. This storm had forced me to take shelter in this godforsaken place, 30 kilometers from the nearest town, with no cell service and a radio that crackled with nothing but static. The heating system consisted of 3 ancient kerosene heaters positioned strategically around the cavernous space. They wheezed and sputtered constantly, fighting a losing battle against the cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. The hostel owner, a weathered gaucho named Carlos, had warned us that the wind sometimes extinguished the pilot lights, but assured us he checked them every few hours. That first night, I chose a bottom bunk near the far wall, away from the constant chatter of the other guests. The mattress was thin and lumpy, covered with a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of mildew and previous occupants. I arranged my belongings in the small metal locker beside the bed: passport, wallet, journal, and the small LED headlamp that had become my constant companion. Sleep came fitfully. The wind never stopped howling, creating a constant white noise punctuated by the building's protests. Every few hours, one of the heaters would gutter and die, leaving that section of the warehouse to grow progressively colder until Carlos shuffled over to relight it. The man never seemed to sleep, moving through the darkness like a ghost, muttering in Spanish as he tended to his mechanical charges. I woke on the second morning to find frost coating the inside of the windows. My breath came in visible puffs, and I could feel the cold had penetrated deep into my bones. The German backpackers were huddled together on the far side of the room, sharing body heat under a pile of sleeping bags. The Australian couple had pulled their bunks closer together, creating a makeshift fortress against the cold. But it was the silence that unsettled me most. Not the absence of sound, the wind still raged outside, but something else. A quality to the quiet spaces between gusts that felt heavy with attention, like being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling as I made my way to the small kitchen area for coffee. The instant brew tasted like rust and disappointment, but the warmth was welcome. Carlos emerged from somewhere in the back of the building, nodding at me without speaking. His eyes looked tired, bloodshot, but alert. Always alert. "How long do these storms usually last?" I asked him in my broken Spanish. He shrugged, pouring himself coffee from the same battered pot. "Sometimes days, sometimes weeks. The wind, she decides." The way he said it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. That afternoon, the power went out entirely. Carlos produced a collection of battery-powered lanterns and candles, transforming the industrial space into something more primitive and threatening. Shadows shifted and writhed across the walls, and every corner seemed to hide potential movement. The other guests gathered near the center of the room, drawn together by the weak circles of light like moths to flames. I retreated to my bunk with a paperback novel, but found myself reading the same paragraph over and over, unable to concentrate. The sensation of being observed had intensified throughout the day, becoming an almost physical pressure against my skin. Several times I'd turned quickly, expecting to catch someone staring, but found only empty bunks and dancing shadows. Night fell early, or maybe time had lost all meaning in the eternal twilight of the storm. The others settled into their sleeping bags, and Carlos made his rounds with a flashlight, checking the heaters and murmuring reassurances that felt more like incantations against the dark. I lay in my bunk, staring up at the metal slats of the bed above me, listening to the symphony of wind and creaking metal. Gradually, the whispered conversations of the other guests faded into sleep. Even Carlos's periodic shuffling grew less frequent. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the concrete floor. But not the familiar sound of Carlos's worn boots or the soft padding of someone making a late-night trip to the bathroom. These steps had a different quality, heavier, yet somehow muffled, as if the person walking was trying to move quietly despite their weight. I held my breath, straining to track the sound. The footsteps seemed to circle the room, staying to the outer edges, just beyond the reach of the dim emergency lighting. I wanted to sit up, to look around, but something primitive in my brain screamed at me to remain still, to feign sleep. The steps paused. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, slowly, the footsteps resumed, moving closer to my section of the warehouse, closer to my bunk. They stopped directly beside my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on keeping my breathing steady and deep, the way someone asleep would breathe. But every nerve in my body was screaming with awareness. Someone was standing right next to me, close enough that I should have been able to hear their breathing, feel their presence. But I heard nothing except the wind. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away, fading into the ambient noise of the storm. I waited until my muscles ached from the tension, before finally allowing myself to relax. When I opened my eyes, the warehouse looked exactly as it had before. Empty bunks, sleeping travelers, and shadows that could hide anything. I told myself it had been Carlos, making his rounds. Or maybe one of the other guests, restless from the cold and stress. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. The sound had been wrong, the presence too heavy, too deliberate. The third night, I decided to stay awake. I positioned myself so I could see most of the warehouse while appearing to sleep. My head turned toward the wall, but my eyes opened just enough to maintain surveillance. The others settled into their usual routines, quiet conversations that faded into snores, Carlos's periodic maintenance checks, the eternal symphony of wind and creaking metal, Around 2 a.m., one of the heaters sputtered and died. The sudden absence of its mechanical breathing seemed to trigger something in the darkness. That's when I saw it. Movement in the far corner, near the loading dock doors. At first I thought it was Carlos, coming to relight the heater. But the figure was wrong. Too tall, moving too smoothly across the uneven floor. And there was something about its outline that didn't quite make sense, as if it were wrapped in something bulky and shapeless. The figure moved from bunk to bunk, pausing beside each sleeping traveler. It would stand motionless for long minutes, and I had the horrible impression that it was studying each person, memorizing their faces, their breathing patterns, their dreams. I watched in frozen terror as it worked its way around the room, coming inevitably closer to my position. My rational mind screamed that this had to be Carlos, that I was letting paranoia and isolation twist my perceptions. But Carlos was shorter, broader, and moved with the careful gait of someone who'd spent decades on horseback. This figure glided across the concrete like smoke given form. When it reached the bunk directly across from mine, I got my first clear look. The figure was covered in snow, not wearing snow gear, not dusted with flakes from a recent trip outside, but actually encased in a thick layer of white that seemed to shift and swirl despite the absence of any wind inside the building. The snow clung to its form so completely that I couldn't make out any human features. No face, no hands, just a vaguely person-shaped accumulation of winter itself. It turned toward my bunk. Where its face should have been, there was only a smooth expanse of white. But I felt its attention focus on me with the intensity of a spotlight. My skin crawled with the certainty that it knew I was awake, knew I was watching, and was pleased by my fear. We stared at each other across the narrow aisle between bunks. The snow figure didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't show any sign of life except for that terrible awareness radiating from its featureless face. The snow on its surface continued to shift and swirl in impossible patterns, and I realized with growing horror that the movement was rhythmic, like breathing, like a heartbeat made visible. Time stretched into infinity. My eyes began to water from the strain of not blinking, but I was terrified that if I closed them for even an instant, the thing would move closer. My muscles cramped from the effort of remaining perfectly still, and my lungs burned as I tried to control my breathing. Then, without warning, the emergency lighting flickered and died. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard the wind pick up outside, growing from its constant howl into something resembling a scream. But underneath that familiar sound, I detected something else. A soft scraping, like snow being dragged across concrete. The sound was moving closer. I fumbled for my headlamp with hands that shook uncontrollably, finally managing to click it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the space where the snow figure had been standing. Nothing. I swept the light frantically across the warehouse, checking every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. The other guests slept on, undisturbed by my panic. Even Carlos was nowhere to be seen, though I could hear him somewhere in the back of the building, swearing in Spanish as he worked to restore power. But at the foot of my bunk, barely visible in the edge of my light beam, was a small pile of snow. It was already melting into the concrete, leaving dark stains that looked disturbingly like footprints. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, if morning had any meaning in this place of eternal storm, I tried to convince myself that exhaustion and stress had created the entire episode. The pile of snow at the foot of my bunk could have come from anywhere. A leak in the roof, Carlos tracking it in on his boots, condensation from the heaters. But the explanations felt hollow, inadequate. During the day, I found myself studying the other guests, searching for any sign that they'd experienced something similar. The Germans seemed more subdued than usual, keeping their voices low and staying close together. The Australian couple argued in whispers, shooting nervous glances at the shadows. Even the silent man from Buenos Aires appeared agitated, his hands trembling as he wrote in a small notebook. Only Carlos seemed unaffected, moving through his routines with the same steady determination. But I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his weathered face creased with something that might have been concern or sympathy. That afternoon, I approached him while he was refilling one of the heaters. "Carlos," I said, keeping my voice casual, "have you ever had any unusual experiences in this place?" He paused in his work, not looking up from the kerosene tank. "What kind of experiences, senor?" "Strange sounds. Visitors who aren't supposed to be here." Now he did look up, his dark eyes searching my face. "You are asking if this place is haunted?" The bluntness of the question caught me off guard. Maybe. Yes." Carlos set down the tank and straightened slowly, his joints creaking almost as much as the building around us. "My grandfather. He worked in this place when it was still for the sheep. He told me stories." "What kind of stories?" "About the workers who died in the blizzard of 1953, caught outside when the storm came, found frozen solid 3 days later. They say the cold, it gets into a man's soul sometimes, makes him forget he's supposed to be dead." The rational part of my mind rejected the explanation immediately. Ghost stories were for children and tourists, not for educated adults experiencing psychological strain. But something in Carlos's tone, in the way he returned to his work without another word, made my skin crawl. That night, I made a decision. Instead of lying in my bunk, waiting for the terror to find me, I would stay alert and mobile. I positioned myself in a chair near the center of the room, wrapped in my sleeping bag like a cocoon, with my headlamp ready and a clear view of the entire warehouse. The other guests thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. I would not be caught helpless again. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I watched Carlos make his rounds, tracked the breathing patterns of the sleeping travelers, memorized every shadow and reflection. My eyes burned from the strain, and my body ached from maintaining the same position, but I refused to let my guard down. Around 3 a.m. the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual, like the heaters failing. This was sudden and sharp, as if someone had opened a door to the outside. My breath began to mist, and I could feel the cold seeping through my sleeping bag like ice water. That's when I noticed the silence. The wind had stopped. After 3 days of constant howling, the sudden absence was deafening. In that unnatural quiet, I could hear things I'd missed before. The drip of melting snow, the settling of the building, the soft whisper of my own breathing, and footsteps. They came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the warehouse like a slow parade of the damned. Not one set of feet, but many, all moving in perfect synchronization. The sound was wrong on every level, too heavy for human steps, yet too light for the weights they seemed to carry. I clicked on my headlamp and swept it across the room. They were everywhere. Snow figures stood beside every bunk, each one identical to the entity I'd seen the night before. Tall, shapeless, encased in swirling white that defied physics and reason. They stood perfectly still, but I could feel their attention focused on the sleeping travelers like a physical weight. And they were all looking at me. Dozens of featureless faces turned in my direction, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My headlamp beam seemed to grow weaker, absorbed by the unnatural darkness that surrounded each figure. The snow on their surfaces began to swirl faster, and I realized they were excited by my awareness, fed by my fear. I tried to move, to wake the others, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. The cold had seeped into my muscles, turning them to stone. I could only sit and watch as the snow figures began to move closer, gliding across the concrete with their impossible grace. They formed a circle around my chair, and I understood with crystal clarity that this was the moment I would die. Not from violence or injury, but from cold. From becoming one of them. Another frozen soul lost in the eternal storm. The figures raised their arms in unison, and the temperature plummeted toward absolute zero. That's when the lights came back on. The sudden flood of harsh fluorescent light banished the darkness and the cold in an instant. I found myself alone in the chair, gasping like a drowning man, my headlamp beam cutting weakly through perfectly normal air. The other guests slept on, undisturbed. Carlos emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "Generator is fixed," he announced quietly. "Should be stable now." I stared at him, at the empty spaces where the snow figures had been, at my hands that should have been frozen solid but moved freely. The rational explanations lined up in my mind like soldiers. Hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide poisoning from the faulty heaters, a psychological break triggered by isolation and stress. But at the foot of my chair, barely visible in the harsh light, dozens of small puddles reflected the fluorescent bulbs like accusing eyes. I packed my belongings before dawn and left money on Carlos's desk for the extra night. The storm had finally broken, and the road to town was passable. As I loaded my backpack into the taxi that would take me away from that place, Carlos appeared in the doorway. "Señor," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You saw them, didn't you?" I turned to face him, this weathered man who'd spent years tending to travelers in a place that death had never quite learned to leave. "I don't know what I saw." He nodded slowly, as if my uncertainty was exactly the answer he'd expected. "That is probably for the best." The taxi pulled away, carrying me back toward civilization and warmth and explanations that made sense. But as we crested the hill that would hide the converted warehouse from view, I looked back one final time. In the morning sunlight, the building looked exactly like what it was, a simple shelter for travelers, nothing more threatening than rust and worn concrete. But there, clearly visible against the dark walls, I could see the white outlines where snow had been pressed against the windows from the inside. I never told anyone about those 3 nights in Patagonia. Who would believe me? But sometimes, when winter storms rage outside my city apartment, I catch myself checking the locks on my doors and windows. Not because I think locked doors would stop them, but because the sound of wind still makes me remember the weight of invisible eyes and the terrible patience of things that no longer need to breathe. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I feel them watching still, waiting in the cold places of the world for another traveler foolish enough to seek solitude in their domain. The snow remembers everything, Carlos had told me as I left, and it never forgets a face. I just pray it's forgotten mine. Story 4. The advertisement had seemed almost too good to be true. Vintage seaside inn, authentic coastal experience. Rates so low you'll think it's 1952. I should have paid more attention to that last part. The GPS led me down increasingly narrow roads until the asphalt gave way to crushed shells and sand. When the title inn finally materialized through the salt-heavy mist, it looked exactly like the sepia-toned photograph from the website: weathered shingles, wraparound porch, and windows that caught the dying light like tired eyes. The ocean crashed somewhere beyond the dunes, invisible but insistent. I parked beside the only other vehicle in sight, a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in months. The front desk sat in a lobby that smelled of brine and something else, something organic and persistent that made me breathe through my mouth. Behind the counter, an elderly man with skin like parchment barely looked up from his ledger when I announced my arrival. "Room 12, he said, sliding a brass key across wood worn smooth by decades of salt air. "Dinner's at 7, breakfast at 8. Don't leave your windows open during high tide." I waited for him to elaborate, but he'd already returned to his ledger, pen scratching against paper with the rhythm of waves against shore. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed to the second floor, my duffel bag feeling heavier with each step. Sand had somehow found its way into the hallway carpet, creating a gritty texture beneath my shoes that followed me down the corridor. Room 12 sat at the far end, its door slightly ajar despite the key in my hand. Inside, the room held that peculiar mustiness of spaces that had been closed too long, mixed with the ever-present salt air. The furniture looked authentically vintage, not the carefully curated kind, but genuinely old pieces that had weathered decades of coastal humidity. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its posts carved with what might have been nautical themes, though the details had been worn smooth by time and moisture. I set my bag on the dresser and moved to the window. The view should have been spectacular, nothing but ocean stretching to the horizon, but the glass was fogged with condensation that seemed to come from inside rather than out. When I tried to wipe it clear, my hand came away damp and slightly gritty, as if the condensation carried microscopic particles of sand. The shower in the small bathroom produced water that tasted faintly of brine, though I suppose that was normal for a coastal location. As I unpacked, I noticed the walls seemed to retain sounds differently here. My footsteps echoed longer than they should, and sometimes I could swear I heard corresponding footsteps from the room above, though the building was only 2 stories tall. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have accommodated 30 guests, but held only 3 small tables. I was the sole diner, served by a woman who might have been the desk clerk's sister or wife. The same weathered features, the same reluctance to make eye contact. The fish was fresh and perfectly prepared, but it carried that same briny aftertaste as the water, and I found myself drinking wine to wash away the lingering salt. When I asked about other guests, she simply gestured toward the windows overlooking the porch. "They prefer to keep to themselves," she said, though the porch appeared empty save for a few rocking chairs that moved gently in the evening breeze. Back in my room, I tried to connect to the internet, but the signal seemed to come and go with the tide. During the brief moments of connectivity, I researched the inn's history. Built in 1923, it had operated continuously except for a period in the 1970s when it had been temporarily closed for renovations. The articles I found were frustratingly vague about the nature of those renovations or why they had taken 3 years to complete. As night fell, the sounds of the building settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. The ocean's roar provided a constant backdrop, but beneath it I began to notice other sounds. Floorboards creaking in patterns that suggested footsteps, doors opening and closing in distant parts of the building, and occasionally, what sounded like voices engaged in quiet conversation. I told myself it was simply the acoustics of an old building combined with the ever-present sound of wind and waves. But as the hours passed and the sounds continued, I found myself listening more intently, trying to discern words or meaning in what might have been just the building settling. Around midnight, I heard the front door open and close several times in succession. Guests arriving late, I reasoned, though I hadn't seen any headlights in the parking area. I moved to my window and peered down at the entrance, but the porch remained empty. The rocking chairs continued their gentle motion, and something about their rhythm seemed synchronized now, as if pushed by more than just the coastal breeze. Sleep came fitfully. I found myself waking every hour or so, disturbed by sounds that seemed to come from just outside my door. Footsteps in the hallway, the soft brush of fabric against walls, and once, what sounded distinctly like someone trying the handle of my door. Each time I investigated, the hallway was empty, though I noticed the sand on the carpet seemed to have been disturbed by recent passage. The next morning brought heavy clouds and the promise of rain. At breakfast, I was again the only diner, served by the same silent woman. When I mentioned the sounds from the night before, she simply nodded as if I'd commented on the weather. "The building breathes with the tide," she said. "Always has. You'll get used to it." But I wasn't sure I wanted to get used to it. There was something about the quality of those sounds that suggested intentionality rather than random settling. After breakfast, I decided to explore the inn more thoroughly, perhaps to understand the source of the nocturnal disturbances. The first floor revealed little beyond the lobby, dining room, and what appeared to be staff quarters. But on the second floor, I discovered that the building was larger than it appeared from outside. My hallway was only one of 3, and as I explored the others, I found they all showed the same signs of recent use: sand in the carpets, doors slightly ajar, and that persistent smell of brine and something organic. Yet I encountered no other guests. The desk clerk, when I asked, simply shrugged and mentioned that many visitors preferred privacy and quiet. His manner suggested this was a common inquiry and that my curiosity was slightly inappropriate. By afternoon, the weather had deteriorated into a proper coastal storm. Rain lashed the windows, and the wind howled around the building's corners with increasing intensity. The desk clerk informed me that the bridge connecting the inn to the main road was subject to flooding during severe weather, and it might be wise to plan on staying an extra night, as if I had a choice. My phone showed no signal whatsoever now, and when I tried to start my car, the engine turned over reluctantly before dying completely. The battery wasn't dead. The light still functioned, but something about the electrical system seemed affected by the storm's proximity. The second night proved more unsettling than the first. The storm outside provided a backdrop of constant noise that somehow made the building's internal sounds more noticeable rather than masking them. The footsteps in the hallway came more frequently now, and always seemed to pause just outside my door before continuing. Around 2 in the morning, I heard voices more clearly than before. They seemed to come from just beyond my walls, as if people were standing in the hallway engaged in urgent whispered conversation. I couldn't make out words, but the tone suggested anxiety or distress. When I pressed my ear to the door, the voices stopped immediately, as if aware of my listening. I waited several minutes before carefully opening the door. The hallway was empty, but the sand on the carpet showed clear evidence of foot traffic, multiple sets of prints leading in both directions, all still damp and gritty beneath my bare feet. The most disturbing detail was that some of the prints seemed to disappear partway down the hall, as if whoever had made them had simply stopped existing. The third day brought no improvement in the weather, but a significant change in the inn's atmosphere. The staff, while still minimally communicative, seemed more anxious. They moved with purpose through the building, carrying towels and buckets to areas I assumed were experiencing leaks. But when I offered to help, they declined with an urgency that suggested my assistance would be more hindrance than help. More concerning was the change in the building itself. The sand in the hallways was no longer confined to the carpets. It had begun accumulating in corners and against walls, as if the ocean outside was somehow seeping into the structure. The smell of brine had intensified, and beneath it was that organic odor I'd noticed from the beginning, now strong enough to be almost overwhelming. During lunch, again, I was the only diner. I asked the serving woman directly about the other guests. She paused in clearing my plate, her weathered hands gripping the china with unusual force. "They don't come down during storms," she said finally. "Prefer to wait it out in their rooms. Some have been waiting quite a while." The way she said "quite a while" sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. When I pressed for clarification, she simply shook her head and retreated to the kitchen. That afternoon, I decided to investigate the third floor, which I'd assumed was staff quarters or storage. The stairs leading up were narrower than those to the second floor, and they creaked with a different timber, a wet, swollen sound that suggested prolonged exposure to moisture. At the top, I found a hallway identical to those below, except the sand here was deeper, creating drifts against the walls that suggested years rather than days of accumulation. The doors along this hallway stood open, revealing rooms that were clearly not in use for living guests. Furniture covered in salt-stained sheets, windows so fogged with condensation that they appeared opaque, and everywhere the smell of brine so strong it made my eyes water. But what disturbed me most was the evidence of recent occupancy. Impressions in the sand where people had walked, damp spots on the sheets where bodies might have rested, and in one room, a mirror that showed not my reflection, but something else entirely. I stared at that mirror for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The surface seemed to reflect not the room I stood in, but another room entirely, one flooded with several inches of seawater, where furniture floated gently and shadows moved with the rhythm of underwater currents. And in those shadows, I could swear I saw figures moving, indistinct but purposeful, as if they belonged in that submerged world. When I turned away from the mirror and looked back, it showed only my own pale reflection in an ordinary room. But the image of that flooded space lingered in my mind with the persistence of an actual memory. The third night brought the storm's full fury. Wind howled around the building with such force that the windows rattled in their frames, and the rain struck the glass like handfuls of thrown pebbles. But inside the building, the sounds had changed entirely. What had been occasional footsteps and whispered conversations had become constant activity, doors opening and closing, voices raised in what sounded like urgent discussion, and beneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify, but that reminded me of water lapping against a shore. I tried to sleep but found it impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard sounds that seemed to come from inside my room rather than outside it. The soft splash of footsteps in shallow water, the drip of moisture from overhead, and occasionally, voices so close they seemed to be speaking directly into my ear. But when I opened my eyes, the room was always empty, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning through the fogged windows. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made me sit up in bed with complete alertness. Someone was knocking on my door. Not the tentative knock of a confused guest, or the authoritative rap of staff, but a desperate pounding that spoke of genuine urgency. Between the knocks, I could hear a voice calling, though the words were muffled by the door and the storm. I approached the door cautiously, noting that the carpet beneath my feet was now noticeably damp. The knocking continued, accompanied by what sounded like pleas for help. But when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The pounding continued, clearly coming from my door, but there was no one there to make the sound. I backed away from the door, my heart racing with a fear I couldn't entirely rationalize. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my skin crawl. The slow scrape of fingernails against wood, as if someone on the other side was trying to claw their way through. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in the bathroom, the only room with a lock that felt substantial. Through the door, I could hear the activity in my room, footsteps on the wet carpet, the creak of bed springs as if someone had lain down, and occasionally, voices speaking in conversational tones about things I couldn't quite understand. Dawn brought a temporary reprieve from both the storm and the night's disturbances. The building fell silent except for the constant background roar of the ocean, and when I emerged from the bathroom, my room appeared normal except for the carpet, which was now thoroughly soaked with seawater. At breakfast, I confronted the desk clerk directly. I described the night's events, the sounds, the wet carpets, the evidence of other guests who never appeared in the common areas. He listened with the patient expression of someone who had heard similar complaints many times before. "The building has always been sensitive to the tides," he said finally, "especially during storms. Some guests find the experience unsettling. Others come to appreciate the unique atmosphere." When I demanded to know about the other guests, his expression grew more serious. "The inn has a long history," he said. "Not all of our guests have checked out in the traditional sense. Some find the location so restful that they prefer to extend their stay indefinitely." The way he said it made my stomach clench with an unnamed dread. I asked directly if he meant that people had died here, but he shook his head. "Not died," he said. "Changed. The ocean has a way of claiming what it wants, and this building sits right at the edge of its influence. Sometimes the tide brings in more than just water." I demanded he call the police, the Coast Guard, anyone who could help me leave, but he simply gestured toward the phone on the front desk, its receiver hanging loose from a cord that had been severed. The cell towers, he explained, had been damaged by the storm. I was trapped, and as the day wore on, I began to understand that my situation was far more precarious than simple mechanical failure or weather delays. The inn itself seemed to be changing around me. The sand in the hallways grew deeper with each passing hour, and the smell of brine was now so strong that it seemed to coat the inside of my mouth. Most disturbing, the boundaries between the building and the ocean seemed to be dissolving. By evening, I could hear waves lapping not just outside the building but inside it as well, a sound that seemed to come from the lower floors. When I investigated, I found the lobby partially flooded with seawater that reflected the ceiling lights like stars in a dark sky. The desk clerk sat behind his counter as if nothing had changed, though the water now came up to his chest. "High tide," he explained, as if this were a daily occurrence. "It'll recede by morning, always does." But I was beginning to suspect that morning might not come, at least not the kind of morning I understood. The building seemed to exist in its own temporal space now, governed by tides rather than the passage of time. And I was beginning to understand what had happened to the other guests, why their footsteps left trails that disappeared, why their voices carried the hollow echo of underwater spaces. The inn wasn't just haunted, it was transitioning, moving between the world I knew and some other place where the ocean's rules applied. And every guest who stayed too long during this transition became part of that other world, neither fully alive nor entirely gone, but suspended in the space between tides. As the fourth night fell, and the water continued to rise through the building, I realized that my choice was no longer whether to leave, but whether to resist what seemed to be an inevitable transformation. The voices outside my door had become constant now, no longer pleading for entry but offering invitation, speaking of the peace that came with surrender, the relief of letting go of the exhausting effort of remaining solid and separate. I barricaded my door one final time, not against intruders, but against my own growing desire to open it and step into whatever lay beyond. Because I was beginning to understand that the choice wasn't really mine to make. The inn had been drawing me here for reasons I was only beginning to comprehend, and every hour I remained brought me closer to understanding why some guests never checked out. The tide was rising, inside and out, and I was no longer certain which world I belonged to, or if the distinction even mattered anymore. Outside my door, the voices had grown patient, as if they knew that eventually, inevitably, I would join them in their endless wait between the worlds of land and sea. And as the water seeped under my door and began to pool around my feet, I wondered if I was still trying to escape, or if I was simply delaying my acceptance of where I truly belonged. Story 5. The job posting had been simple enough. Winter caretaker needed for historic colonial estate. Remote location. 3 months. Room and board provided. What it hadn't mentioned was the way the wind would howl through the gaps in the 200-year-old clapboard siding, or how the floorboards would groan under my feet as if the house itself were breathing. Most importantly, it hadn't mentioned him. I first saw the man in the top hat on my third evening at the Millfield estate. November had settled over the Connecticut hills like a gray shroud, and I'd spent the day winterizing the gardens and securing loose shutters against the coming storms. The work was methodical, satisfying in its simplicity after months of unemployment in the city. Here, surrounded by maple trees that had shed their last crimson leaves, I could finally sleep without the constant hum of traffic bleeding through thin apartment walls. The wraparound porch stretched across the front of the Colonial like a wooden smile, complete with white railings that had been freshly painted before my arrival. 6 rocking chairs sat in perfect intervals, their curved runners worn smooth by generations of use. It was in the chair closest to the main door that I first glimpsed him. Through the kitchen window, as I prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, movement caught my peripheral vision. A figure sat hunched in the far rocking chair, the distinctive silhouette of a top hat unmistakable against the dying light. The chair moved with a steady rhythm, back and forth, as if someone were gently pushing against the porch floor with their feet. I set down my spoon and moved closer to the window, cupping my hands against the glass to block the reflection of the kitchen light. The figure continued rocking, oblivious to my observation. He wore what appeared to be a dark coat, possibly wool, and his hands rested on the chair's wooden arms. From this distance, I couldn't make out his face beneath the brim of his hat, but something about his posture suggested age, perhaps weariness. My first thought was that someone from the Historical Society had stopped by to check on the property. Mrs. Hartwell, the estate's owner, had mentioned that volunteers occasionally visited to assess the building's condition. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and stepped onto the porch. The evening air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney and the earthy smell of wet leaves. My footsteps echoed hollowly against the wooden planks as I approached the rocking chair. But when I reached the spot where the figure had been sitting, I found nothing. The chair sat motionless, its paint gleaming faintly in the porch light I'd just switched on. "Hello?" I called into the gathering darkness. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered, rustling through the bare branches of the oak trees that flanked the property. I examined the chair more closely, running my fingers along its arms and back. The wood felt cold, but otherwise unremarkable. No warmth remained from a recent occupant. Perhaps my eyes had played tricks on me. The combination of unfamiliar shadows and my own fatigue could easily create illusions. I'd been working 12-hour days since my arrival, and the isolation was more profound than I'd expected. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a winding dirt road, and cell phone service was spotty at best. I returned to the kitchen and finished my dinner, though the soup had grown cold and tasted of nothing. Through the window, I kept glancing at the empty rocking chair, but it remained still for the rest of the evening. The next morning brought the first real storm of winter. Ice pellets struck the windows with tiny, insistent fingers, and the wind drove sheets of rain across the property with enough force to bend the younger trees nearly horizontal. I spent the day indoors, checking the heating system and inventorying supplies in the basement. The cellar smelled of damp stone and old wood, its low ceiling supported by hand-hewn beams that still bore the marks of their original shaping. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with preserves and canned goods that Mrs. Hartwell had left for my use. As I counted jars of pickled vegetables and home-canned tomatoes, the storm raged overhead with increasing intensity. It was while organizing the pantry that I noticed the first mark. A wooden crate that had been serving as a makeshift table bore what looked like a series of fresh scratches along its edge. The marks were deep and deliberate, carved with something sharp enough to cut through the wood's grain. They formed a pattern that almost resembled letters, though I couldn't quite make them out in the cellar's dim light. I carried the crate upstairs and examined it under the kitchen's fluorescent fixture. The scratches were definitely intentional, gouged into the wood with considerable force. They spelled out a single word, repeated 3 times in a shaky, uneven hand. Nathaniel, Nathaniel, Nathaniel. My stomach tightened. Mrs. Hartwell had given me a brief history of the property when she'd hired me, mentioning that it had been built in 1847 by a merchant named Nathaniel Millfield. The house had remained in the family until the 1970s, when the last direct descendant had donated it to the Historical Society. She'd made no mention of any recent visitors or workers who might have access to the basement. I set the crate aside and checked the cellar door. The lock showed no signs of tampering, and I clearly remembered securing it the previous evening. The house had been empty when I'd arrived 3 days ago, and I'd been thorough in my initial inspection of every room and storage space. The rational explanation was that the marks had been there all along, and I'd simply failed to notice them during my earlier inventory. Old wood often bore the scratches and dents of years of use, and someone could have carved the name decades ago. But the wood around the letters looked fresh, almost white against the darker, weathered surface of the crate. I spent the remainder of the day in a state of heightened awareness, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing without cause, voices calling from somewhere beyond the storm. But the house remained quiet, except for the natural sounds of old wood settling and wind finding its way through small gaps in the walls. That evening, as the storm finally began to subside, I saw him again. This time I was reading in the living room when movement outside drew my attention. Through the large front windows, I could see the porch clearly illuminated by the exterior lights. The same figure sat in the same rocking chair, his top hat tilted slightly forward as if he were dozing. The chair moved with that same gentle, rhythmic motion, creating a soft creaking sound that somehow carried through the storm windows. I set down my book and moved to the window, taking care to stay in the shadows where he couldn't see me watching. The figure appeared more solid this time, more real. His coat was definitely wool, dark blue or black, and his hands gripped the chair's arms with white-knuckled intensity. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in his posture, as if he were struggling against some invisible force. I watched for nearly 10 minutes, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. The rocking continued at the same measured pace, never slowing or speeding up. Occasionally, the wind would shift his coat slightly, but he never turned his head or acknowledged my presence behind the glass. Finally, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I moved slowly toward the front door, keeping my eyes on the figure through the windows. He remained in the chair as I turned the deadbolt and eased the door open. The hinges squeaked softly, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the evening quiet. The figure's rocking stopped immediately. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, and I had the distinct impression that he was listening, waiting for my next move. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden planks cold against my feet through my thin socks. The air carried the clean smell of rain-washed earth and the distant scent of wood smoke. 10 feet separated me from the rocking chair, but the distance felt vast and somehow dangerous. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can I help you with something?" The figure began to turn his head in my direction, and I caught a glimpse of pale skin beneath the hat's brim. But before I could see his face clearly, he simply wasn't there anymore. The chair sat empty, still rocking slightly from his sudden absence, but the porch was otherwise deserted. I ran to the edge of the porch and scanned the yard, but saw no movement in any direction. The ground was soft from the day's rain, yet I could find no footprints leading away from the house. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the evening air. Back inside, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon from a bottle I'd brought from the city and tried to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Stress could cause hallucinations, and I'd been under considerable pressure in recent months. The job loss, the divorce proceedings, the move to this isolated location. Any combination of these factors could be affecting my perception. But the next morning brought fresh evidence that something was genuinely wrong. I found them in the dining room first. Deep scratches carved into the surface of the mahogany table that Mrs. Hartwell had specifically asked me to protect with furniture covers. The marks were fresh, cutting through the wood's finish down to the pale grain beneath. They spelled out Nathaniel in letters nearly 6 inches tall, the strokes violent and desperate. Similar marks covered the sideboard, the windowsills, even the wooden window frames. Nathaniel, Nathaniel, Nathaniel. Carved over and over with what must have been considerable effort and a very sharp blade. The living room had been similarly defaced, with his name gouged into the mantelpiece, the coffee table, and the arms of 2 antique chairs. I spent the morning documenting the damage with my phone's camera, though I dreaded the conversation I'd have to have with Mrs. Hartwell. The destruction was extensive and clearly deliberate. Someone had spent hours in the house during the night, methodically vandalizing every piece of wooden furniture they could find. But how had they gotten in? Every door and window remained locked from the inside, their security devices undisturbed. I'd been a light sleeper since childhood, especially in unfamiliar places, yet I'd heard nothing during the night beyond the usual sounds of the old house settling. I called Mrs. Hartwell from the landline in the kitchen, dreading her response to what I had to report. "Scratches?" she said, her voice tight with concern. "What kind of scratches?" "Someone carved a name into the furniture. Nathaniel. It's carved everywhere, dozens of times." A long pause followed, filled only with the static of the old phone line. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here." Her voice had taken on a strange quality, distant and troubled. "Has anyone else been to the house? Any visitors or workers?" "No one. I've been alone since I arrived. But someone was definitely here last night. They must have had a key or—" "There are no other keys," she interrupted. "I have the only spare, and it's in my safe at home." Another pause. Longer this time. "I need to tell you something about the house," she finally said. "Something I should have mentioned before you took the job." My grip tightened on the phone's receiver. Nathaniel Millfield, the man who built the house, he had some difficulties in his later years. Mental difficulties. His family found him one morning in 1863, sitting on the front porch. He'd been carving his own name into everything he could reach. The chair, the railing, even the porch floor. They said he'd been at it all night, and he couldn't remember doing any of it. What happened to him? He died that winter. They found him on the porch during a blizzard, still sitting in that same rocking chair, frozen solid. The strange thing was they'd locked him in his room the night before because of his episodes. But somehow he'd gotten out, gotten dressed, and made his way to the porch. The doors were still locked from the inside when they found him the next morning. The phone felt slick in my sweating palm. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you saying you think—" "I'm saying the house has a history that some people find unsettling. The last 3 caretakers all quit within a week. They reported similar incidents, seeing things, hearing things, and always the carving, always his name, cut into the wood." The kitchen suddenly felt impossibly cold, despite the heating system's steady hum. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I needed someone to stay for the winter, and because I hoped." She trailed off. "Look, it might be nothing. Old houses play tricks on people. The isolation, the history, it can affect your mind. But if you're not comfortable staying, I understand." I looked around the kitchen, noting how the shadows seemed deeper than they should be, how every creak of the old wood now carried a sinister undertone. "I'll stay," I heard myself say. at least for now. But that decision proved harder to maintain as the days passed. The carving continued nightly, always in rooms I wasn't occupying. I'd wake to find fresh marks on furniture, walls, even the wooden floor itself. Nathaniel appeared everywhere, sometimes spelled correctly, sometimes with letters missing or reversed, as if carved by someone whose hands shook with cold or madness. I began sleeping with a chair propped against my bedroom door and a baseball bat within reach, though I wasn't sure what good either would do against whatever was happening. The figure in the top hat appeared on the porch with increasing frequency, always in the same chair, always rocking with that measured, hypnotic rhythm. Sometimes I would watch him for hours, noting details that seemed to shift and change even as I observed them. His coat appeared to be wool one night, leather the next. His hat sat at different angles, sometimes tilted forward, sometimes back. Once, during a particularly clear evening, I could have sworn I saw his breath misting in the cold air. But when I stepped outside to investigate, the chair was empty, and the night was warm enough that my own breath remained invisible. The worst part was the sound. It started as a barely perceptible scratching, like mice moving within the walls. But as the nights progressed, the sound grew louder and more defined. The unmistakable noise of metal cutting through wood, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house's rooms like a heartbeat made of violence. I would follow the sound from room to room, but it always seemed to move just ahead of my search, leading me through the house like a macabre game of hide and seek. Sometimes it would stop entirely when I entered a room, only to resume behind me as soon as I moved on. Other times, I would find fresh carving marks still bright with wood shavings, the wood warm to the touch as if the knife had just finished its work. During my third week at the estate, I discovered something that made me question not just what was happening, but my own grip on reality. I'd been inventorying the items in the front hall closet when I found an old photograph album wrapped in tissue paper and tucked behind a stack of winter coats. The leather cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the brass clasp was green with age. Inside, carefully preserved behind tissue paper, were dozens of photographs dating from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s. Family portraits, landscape shots of the property in its prime, formal gatherings on the front lawn. But it was the photograph on the album's final page that stopped my heart. The image showed the front porch of the house, taken sometime in the late 1800s based on the clothing and photographic quality. 6 rocking chairs sat in perfect intervals along the porch's length, just as they did today. And in the chair closest to the main door, exactly where I'd been seeing the figure in the top hat, sat a man in dark wool coat and formal black hat. Even allowing for the photograph's age and the formal posing typical of the era, the resemblance to the figure I'd been seeing was unmistakable. The same posture, the same angle of the hat, the same white-knuckled grip on the chair's arms. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in fading ink, Nathaniel Millfield, 1862. The photograph had been taken a year before his death. I stared at the image until my eyes watered, comparing every detail to my memories of the figure on the porch. The coat was identical, down to the pattern of buttons down the front. The hat sat at precisely the same angle. Even his hands were positioned exactly as I'd observed, gripping the chair's arms as if holding on for dear life. But this discovery raised more questions than it answered. How could I have seen details that matched a photograph I'd never seen before? How could my mind have created such an accurate hallucination without any reference material? Unless, of course, it wasn't a hallucination at all. That night, I positioned myself at the living room window with the photograph in my lap, determined to compare the image directly to whatever I might see on the porch. The November air had turned bitter, and frost was already forming on the window glass, despite the house's heating system. He appeared just after midnight, materializing in the chair as if he'd always been there. I held the photograph up to the window, comparing the figure in the old image to the one rocking gently in the darkness. Every detail matched perfectly: the coat, the hat, the posture, the grip on the chair's arms. But as I watched, something changed. The figure's rocking began to slow, then stopped entirely. Slowly, as if the movement caused him great effort, he turned his head toward the window where I sat. For the first time, I could see his face clearly. It was exactly as it appeared in the photograph, but somehow wrong. The features were sharp and aristocratic, with a pointed beard and hollow cheeks. But his eyes were black holes in his face, empty sockets that seemed to absorb the porch light rather than reflect it. Those empty eyes fixed on mine through the window, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather seep into my bones. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile or a scream. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell which. He raised one arm and pointed directly at me, his finger aimed at the window like an accusation. His mouth moved as if he were speaking, though no sound reached me through the glass. But I could read his lips clearly enough. "Come outside." I stumbled backward from the window, knocking over the lamp table and sending the photograph fluttering to the floor. When I looked again, the porch was empty, but the rocking chair continued to move back and forth with increasing violence, as if someone invisible were throwing their weight against it repeatedly. The scratching sound started immediately afterward, louder than it had ever been. It seemed to come from every direction at once, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. The sound of metal carving through wood, urgent and desperate, filling the house with a noise like screaming. I ran from room to room, following the sound but never finding its source. In the dining room, I discovered fresh marks appearing on the table's surface even as I watched, carved by an invisible hand that worked with frantic intensity. Nathaniel, 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 over and over, the letters growing larger and more violent with each repetition. The temperature in the house began to drop precipitously. My breath misted in the air, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows. The heating system roared to life, but its warmth seemed to be swallowed by something vast and hungry. By dawn, I had barricaded myself in the kitchen with every sharp knife in the house laid out on the counter before me. Not because I thought they would provide protection, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't the one doing the carving. The scratching had continued until sunrise, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing and the hammering of my heart. I spent that day documenting everything I could remember, writing down every detail of my experiences at the estate. If I was losing my mind, I wanted some record of the process. If something else was happening, someone needed to know. But when I read back over what I'd written, I found gaps in my memory that disturbed me more than any ghostly appearance could have. I couldn't remember arriving at the house, couldn't recall the specific conversation that had led to my hiring. When I tried to think about my life before coming to the estate, I found only vague impressions: a job loss, a divorce, financial problems. But the details remained frustratingly out of reach. I called Mrs. Hartwell again, but the number I'd been given led to a disconnected phone line. When I checked the paperwork she'd given me, I found only blank sheets of paper in the folder where my employment contract should have been. That's when I decided to leave. I packed my belongings hastily, throwing clothes and personal items into my suitcase without regard for organization. Whatever was happening at the Millfield estate, I wanted no part of it. I'd drive back to the city, find a hotel, and sort out the confusion about my employment later. But when I reached the front door, I found it wouldn't open. The deadbolt turned easily enough, and I could hear the mechanism engaging and disengaging with each twist of the key. But the door itself remained firmly closed, as if held shut by some immense force from the outside. I threw my full weight against it, but it didn't budge. The back door was similarly immovable, as were all the windows. I could unlock them, but they refused to open beyond their current positions. I was trapped in the house as effectively as if someone had boarded up every exit from the outside. As evening approached, I returned to the living room window to wait for him to appear. The photograph lay where I'd dropped it the night before, and I picked it up with hands that shook only slightly. He materialized in the rocking chair at exactly midnight, just as he had every night since my arrival. But this time, instead of his usual gentle rocking, he sat perfectly still and stared directly at the window where I stood. I held up the photograph, comparing it once again to the figure on the porch. Everything matched except for those horrible, empty eyes that seemed to look right through me to something beyond. And then I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. In the photograph, Nathaniel Millfield's hands gripped the chair's arms with white-knuckled intensity, but carved into the wood beneath his fingers, clearly visible even in the old image, were letters. Deep scratches that spelled out a single word, repeated over and over in a desperate pattern that covered every inch of the chair's arms. Not Nathaniel, as I'd been finding throughout the house. The word carved into the chair in the photograph was Thomas. Thomas. My name. As the realization hit me, the figure on the porch stood up from the rocking chair and walked slowly toward the window. With each step, his image became clearer, more solid. By the time he reached the glass, I could see every detail of his face. The hollow cheeks, the pointed beard, the empty sockets where his eyes should have been. He pressed his palms against the window and leaned forward until his face was inches from mine, separated only by the thin barrier of glass. When he spoke, his voice was my own voice, speaking my own words. Time to come home, Thomas. I looked down at my hands and saw for the first time the knife I'd been holding. My fingers were cramped around its handle, white-knuckled from gripping it too long. The blade was stained with something dark that flaked away like old paint. Behind me, every piece of wooden furniture in the house bore fresh carving marks. But not Nathaniel, as I thought I'd been seeing. Thomas, 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 carved over and over in letters that grew more desperate and violent with each repetition. I looked back at the window, but the figure was gone. The porch was empty except for the rocking chair, which sat motionless in the cold November air. But in the glass, I could see my own reflection clearly for the first time since arriving at the estate. I was wearing a dark wool coat I didn't remember putting on. On my head sat a black top hat that belonged to another century, another man, another life. And behind me, in the reflection, I could see the figure that had been haunting the porch. He stood in the living room, watching me with those empty, terrible eyes. He was wearing my clothes from the city, the jeans and flannel shirt I'd arrived in 3 weeks ago. His face was younger, cleaner, unmarked by whatever madness had hollowed out my own features. I turned around, but the living room was empty. When I looked back at the window, only my reflection remained. An old man in an antique coat and hat, holding a knife with a blade stained by years of carving. Behind me, the house stretched away into shadows, filled with the whispers of my own name, repeated endlessly in a voice I no longer recognized as my own. I walked to the front door and found it opened easily at my touch. The November air was bitter against my face as I stepped onto the porch and made my way to the rocking chair that had been waiting for me all along. As I settled into the familiar seat and began to rock, I could see through the living room window a young man in modern clothes, unpacking a suitcase and examining the carved furniture with growing alarm. The new caretaker had arrived for the winter. I gripped the chair's arms and felt the carved letters beneath my fingers. Thomas, 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 cut deep into the wood by hands that had once been mine. In a time I could no longer quite remember. The rocking chair creaked softly as I settled into its rhythm, and I wondered how long it would take the young man inside to start carving his own name into everything he could reach. But that was his journey to make, just as I had made mine. I pulled my coat tighter against the cold and continued rocking, waiting for him to notice me watching from the darkness beyond the porch light, waiting for that first, terrible moment of recognition to dawn in his eyes. The circle would close again, as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the house behind me, I could already hear the faint sound of metal cutting through wood, spelling out a name I knew by heart, over and over, in letters that grew more desperate with each passing night. Story 6. The Meridian Hotel had always felt wrong to me, though I couldn't articulate why until that night. Maybe it was the way the Art Deco facade seemed to lean inward, as if the building were slowly collapsing upon itself, or how the geometric patterns in the lobby's marble floor created optical illusions that made my eyes water when I stared too long. The concierge's smile never quite reached his eyes, and the elevator operator, when there was one, always seemed to be looking just past my shoulder, as if something more interesting lurked behind me. I'd been staying there for 3 days on business, and each night the hotel felt more oppressive. The walls seemed closer, the ceilings lower, the hallways longer. I told myself it was stress from the Morrison account, that the sleepless nights were catching up with me. But deep down, I knew something else was at work. On Thursday evening, after a particularly frustrating client dinner, I returned to find the lobby deserted except for a single desk clerk who barely glanced up from his paperwork. The ornate chandeliers cast long shadows across the geometric carpet, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of jazz music bleeding through the walls, though I couldn't determine its source. I pressed the call button for the elevator, noting how the brass had tarnished around the edges where countless fingers had worn away the shine. The elevator arrived with a mechanical wheeze that seemed too loud in the empty lobby, its accordion gate folding back with a metallic groan that set my teeth on edge. Inside, the elevator felt smaller than usual. The walls, paneled in dark wood with intricate inlays, seemed to press inward. The mirror on the back wall showed my reflection, but something about it looked off. My face appeared gaunt, my eyes sunken, as if I hadn't slept in weeks rather than days. I pressed the button for the 5th floor, where my room waited, and felt the familiar lurch as the car began its ascent. The elevator had always been slow, but tonight it seemed to move with deliberate reluctance, as if the building itself were unwilling to let me reach my destination. Between the 2nd and 3rd floors, the car shuddered to a halt. I waited, counting seconds that stretched into minutes. The silence was complete except for the barely audible hum of electricity flowing through old wires. I pressed the button again. Nothing. I tried the emergency button, but it felt loose beneath my finger, unconnected to anything meaningful. The elevator remained motionless, suspended between floors like a held breath. Then, without warning, it lurched upward again. But instead of stopping at the 5th floor as it should have, the car continued climbing. The floor indicator, an ornate brass dial with delicate engravings, showed numbers I'd never seen before, 6, then 7. The elevator came to rest with a gentle bump, and the brass gate accordioned open with a sound like whispered secrets. Beyond the threshold lay a corridor I'd never seen in my 3 days at the hotel. The hallway stretched into darkness, lit only by intermittent wall sconces that cast weak pools of yellow light every few yards. The carpet was different here, not the geometric patterns of the lower floors, but something older, with faded floral motifs that seemed to shift and writhe in the uncertain light. The air that drifted into the elevator carried a scent that made my throat constrict. Old perfume, heavy and cloying, mixed with something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The smell seemed to cling to my nostrils, coating them with an oily residue that made each breath feel thick and labored. I should have pressed the button for the 5th floor again. I should have closed the gate and demanded the elevator take me where I belonged. Instead, I found myself stepping into the corridor, drawn by a curiosity that felt foreign to my normally cautious nature. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet despite the thick carpet, and each step seemed to echo differently, as if the hallway were far longer than it appeared. Behind me, I heard the elevator gate close with finality, followed by the whir of machinery as the car descended, leaving me alone in this impossible space. The wallpaper was faded and water-stained, with patterns that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly, they were just ordinary designs, geometric shapes and stylized flowers. But the moment I looked away, I could swear they began their subtle dance again. Ahead, the corridor branched into multiple paths, a layout that made no architectural sense given the building's footprint. I'd studied the hotel's exterior numerous times during my stay, and there was no way this much space could exist on any floor, let alone one that shouldn't exist at all. It was then that I heard the voices. They started as whispers, so soft I thought they might be the building settling or air moving through old vents. But as I stood still, straining to listen, the sounds resolved into something unmistakably human. Multiple voices, speaking in overlapping murmurs that I couldn't quite understand, but that seemed urgent, even pleading. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off walls that stretched further into darkness than should have been possible. They spoke of service stairs, hidden passages, ways down that the architects had never intended, but that the building had created for itself over decades of housing transient souls. I followed the sound, though I couldn't say why. My feet moved without conscious decision, carrying me deeper into the maze of corridors that branched and twisted in ways that defied logic. The scent of old perfume grew stronger, accompanied now by other smells. Dust that tasted metallic on my tongue, the must of old fabric, and underneath it all, something that reminded me of the inside of a jewelry box that hadn't been opened in years. The voices grew clearer as I walked, and I began to distinguish individual words floating in the whispered chorus. Down, stairs, service, hidden, come. They spoke with the cadence of invitation, but something in their tone made my skin crawl. There was a hunger in those whispers, a desperate need that felt dangerous. Room numbers appeared on doors I passed, but they made no sense. Some were impossibly high, 847, 1203, 2156, while others used letters or symbols I didn't recognize. Most of the doors stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that seemed to extend far beyond what the hallway's width should have allowed. In one, I caught sight of a massive four-poster bed draped in fabric that might once have been white but had yellowed to the color of old bones. In another, a sitting room with furniture covered in dust sheets that moved despite the absence of any breeze. The whispers grew more insistent, and I realized they were coming from these rooms. Dozens of voices speaking in unison, calling me to find the service stairs that would lead me down, down, down to where I belonged. They spoke of others who had found their way to this floor, who had discovered the hidden passages that connected the Meridian Hotel to places that existed only in the spaces between spaces. I quickened my pace, no longer following the voices but trying to escape them. But the corridors seemed to shift around me, turning left when I remembered going right, extending when I expected them to end. The carpet beneath my feet began to feel soft and yielding, as if I were walking on something that had once been alive. The lights flickered, and in the moments of darkness between the flickers, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shapes that might have been people but moved wrong, too fluid, too quick. When the lights steadied, the hallway was always empty, but I could feel eyes watching me from the darkened doorways. The voices reached a crescendo, and suddenly I could understand what they were saying with perfect clarity. They weren't just inviting me to find the service stairs. They were warning me that I was already on them, that the corridor I'd been walking was itself the passage between worlds, between the hotel that existed in normal space and the one that had grown around it like a parasite, feeding on the dreams and fears of everyone who had ever stayed within its walls. I began to run, my footsteps echoing strangely in the thick air. The corridor stretched ahead of me endlessly, the ceiling pressing lower with each step. The whispers followed, growing louder and more desperate, until they were no longer whispers, but a chorus of voices calling my name, a name I hadn't told anyone at the hotel, a name that shouldn't have been known to whatever dwelt in this impossible space. Behind me, I heard the sound of doors opening, one after another, and the shuffle of feet on carpet. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence of those who had answered the call before me, who had found the service stairs and discovered they led nowhere that could be mapped on any architectural plan. The corridor began to slope downward, and I realized with growing horror that I was no longer trying to escape the voices but following them. The service stairs they spoke of weren't a physical structure, but a state of being, a descent into a version of the hotel that existed outside the normal rules of space and time. The slope grew steeper, and the walls on either side began to narrow. The scent of old perfume was overwhelming now, mixed with the smell of decay and something else. Something that reminded me of the way air tastes just before a thunderstorm, electric and full of potential. Ahead, I saw a light. Not the weak yellow glow of the wall sconces, but something brighter, more natural. As I approached, I realized it was the brass gate of an elevator, standing open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. But this wasn't the same elevator I'd entered on the ground floor. The interior was older, more ornate, with details I was certain hadn't been there before. I stumbled into the car, my hands shaking as I reached for the control panel. The buttons were different, more of them, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I pressed what I hoped was the button for the 5th floor, for my room, for the world I understood. The elevator began to move, but I couldn't tell if it was going up or down. The sensation was wrong, as if I were moving sideways, or through dimensions that had no names. The mirror on the back wall showed not my reflection, but the corridor I'd just left, and in it, I could see figures standing in the doorways, watching the elevator depart with expressions of profound sadness. When the car finally stopped and the gate opened, I was back in the lobby. But it wasn't the same lobby I'd left. The geometric patterns in the marble floor were different, the chandeliers hung at strange angles, and the desk clerk who looked up at me was not the same man who had been there when I'd entered the elevator. He smiled, and his teeth were too white, too numerous. "Welcome back, Mr. Thompson," he said, though I had never told him my name. "How was your stay on the 7th floor?" I wanted to tell him there was no 7th floor, that I had been on the 5th floor, that none of what had happened made any sense. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was a whisper. "The service stairs. They're real." He nodded knowingly. "They always have been. The question is, Mr. Thompson, now that you've found them, will you be able to forget they exist?" I left the hotel that night, catching the first flight out of the city. But even now, weeks later, I can still smell that cloying perfume when I close my eyes. I can still hear the whispers calling me back, telling me that the service stairs are always there, in every hotel, every building, every place where people sleep and dream, and forget to question the architecture of their temporary homes. Sometimes, when I'm in an elevator alone, I find myself checking the floor indicator more carefully than I used to. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see numbers that shouldn't be there, climbing higher than any building should allow. The voices tell me that the Meridian Hotel is still waiting, that the 7th floor still exists, along with all the floors above and below it that were never built but have always been there. They tell me that the service stairs aren't just a way down, they're a way through, to all the places that exist in the spaces between the real and the imagined. I've thrown away my business cards, changed my name, moved to a city where the buildings are all new and the elevators have digital displays that show only the floors that should exist. But late at night, when the wind blows through my apartment and carries scents I can't identify, I wonder if any of it matters. Because the service stairs aren't just in the Meridian Hotel. They're everywhere, waiting for the moment when someone's guard is down, when the ordinary world reveals the cracks where the impossible seeps through. And once you've seen them, once you've walked those corridors that exist outside the blueprints and building codes, you can never be entirely sure that the floor you're standing on is the one you think it is. The voices still whisper my name sometimes, telling me stories of others who have found their way to places that shouldn't exist. They speak of service stairs that lead not down but across, connecting buildings and cities, and sometimes entire worlds, through passages that exist only when needed. Only when someone is desperate enough or curious enough or lost enough to step through an elevator door that opens onto impossible things. I tell myself it was stress, exhaustion, a psychological break brought on by too many nights in unfamiliar hotels. But the smell of old perfume lingers in my apartment, and sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see not my own reflection, but a corridor stretching endlessly into darkness, where whispered voices call to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to find the service stairs that will take them home, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. Story 7. The shutter clicked against the humid afternoon air, capturing another burst of color splashed across weathered brick. I'd been documenting street art for 3 years now, but this abandoned sugar mill outside Baton Rouge promised something different. Untouched canvases in a place forgotten by time. The October heat pressed against my shoulders as I adjusted the camera strap, sweat already beading beneath the lens cap hanging around my neck. Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks created a natural curtain around the mill's perimeter, their shadows dancing with each breath of wind. The building itself stood 4 stories tall, its red brick facade stained with decades of Louisiana weather, windows either boarded up or gaping like hollow eyes. But it was the graffiti that had drawn me here. Word on the photography forums was that artists had been using this place as their canvas for years, creating elaborate murals hidden from the world. The kind of work that never made it to galleries but deserved to be preserved before weather or demolition claimed it forever. I'd already spent 2 hours documenting the exterior walls, brilliant blues and greens depicting everything from abstract swirls to realistic portraits of local jazz musicians. My camera's memory card was filling up with shots I knew would be portfolio-worthy. The afternoon light was perfect, casting just enough shadow to give the artwork depth without washing out the colors. As I rounded the building's eastern corner, I found what I'd been hoping for, an entrance. The heavy wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, propped open by a chunk of fallen masonry. A hand-painted sign read, "Keep out," but the paint had faded to barely legible scratches. The interior beckoned with the promise of untouched artwork. Stepping through the doorway felt like crossing into another era. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the scent of old wood, rust, and something else. Something organic and earthy that I couldn't quite identify. My footsteps echoed against concrete floors littered with debris. Broken glass, scraps of metal, and fragments of machinery that once powered this place. Industrial equipment sat frozen in time throughout the cavernous first floor. Massive gears and conveyor belts snaked between steel support columns, their surfaces now serving as impromptu canvases. Here the artwork was more raw, more urgent than what I'd found outside. Messages sprawled across machinery in languages I didn't recognize, intertwined with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I raised my camera and began shooting. The first few shots captured the interplay between urban decay and artistic expression perfectly. Rust-orange machinery contrasted beautifully with electric blue spray paint. Natural light filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, creating dramatic pools of illumination that highlighted different pieces. But as I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen, something caught my attention. In the background of several shots, windows on the upper floors glowed with warm yellow light. I lowered the camera and looked up at those same windows. Dark, empty. Just like they should be in a building that had been without power for decades. Must be a reflection, I reasoned. Afternoon sunlight bouncing off remaining glass panes could easily create that effect. I'd seen similar optical illusions in other abandoned buildings. I continued shooting, working my way deeper into the mill's maze-like interior. Each room revealed new treasures, murals that told stories of struggle and hope, intricate patterns that seemed to move in my peripheral vision, faces painted with such realism that their eyes seemed to track my movement through the space. The temperature inside felt at least 10 degrees cooler than outside, which should have been a relief. Instead, it raised goosebumps along my arms. The air felt charged somehow, like the moments before a thunderstorm when every nerve ending becomes hyper-aware. After an hour of shooting, I paused to review my work. The images were better than I'd hoped. The natural lighting, the raw authenticity of the artwork, the way decay and creation intertwined. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. But every single photograph showed those illuminated windows. Not just one or two now. In shots taken from different angles throughout the building, windows across all the upper floors glowed with that same warm light. Some appeared to have movement behind them, dark shapes passing by like shadows of people going about their daily lives. My hands trembled slightly as I scrolled through the images. In one photograph, taken just minutes ago, I could swear I saw a figure standing at a third-floor window. Blurred, indistinct, but unmistakably human-shaped. And it appeared to be looking down, directly at the camera, directly at me. I forced myself to breathe slowly, mechanically. There had to be an explanation. Digital cameras could malfunction, creating artifacts that looked like lights or figures. Maybe moisture had gotten into the lens. Maybe the memory card was corrupted. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, my photographer's eye told me something different. These weren't artifacts or malfunctions. The light had depth, dimension. The shadows moved with purpose. I looked up at the actual windows again. Still dark, still empty. The sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. Somewhere in the distance, metal creaked. Probably just the building settling, responding to temperature changes as the day progressed. But the sound carried an almost musical quality, like whispered conversations just beyond the range of understanding. I decided to test my theory. Positioning myself directly below the third-floor window where I'd seen the figure, I raised my camera and fired off a quick burst of shots. The motor drive whirred as it captured frame after frame, the mechanical sound echoing off the concrete walls. When I reviewed the images, my mouth went dry. The figure was there, clearer now. Still blurred, but definitely human. It stood at the window, hands pressed against the glass, face turned downward. Watching, waiting, and in the final frame of the burst, its head was tilted at an angle that suggested it was following the movement of my camera. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scrolled through the sequence again. The figure's position shifted subtly between frames, creating the illusion of movement. But this was impossible. These were digital images captured in rapid succession. There was no way for something to move that precisely between frames unless it was moving in real time. The thought hit me like cold water. I was looking at these images seconds after capturing them. If something was moving in the photographs, it wasn't captured movement from the past. It was happening now. I looked up at the window again, shielding my eyes against what little light filtered down from above. Nothing. Just darkness behind cracked glass. But when I raised the camera and looked through the viewfinder, the yellow glow returned immediately. And the figure was still there, still watching. I lowered the camera. Dark window. Raised it again. Glowing light. Watching figure. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, as if my camera lens was somehow serving as a bridge between two different versions of reality. My professional skepticism warred with growing dread. I'd been photographing abandoned buildings for years, had seen every kind of light trick and visual illusion imaginable. This was something else entirely. The smart thing would be to leave, pack up my gear, drive back to the city, and forget about this place. But the photographer in me, the part that had driven me to explore countless forgotten places in search of the perfect shot, refused to walk away without understanding what was happening. I moved to different locations throughout the building, taking test shots from various angles. The results were consistent and increasingly disturbing. Every photograph showed windows blazing with warm light, and in many of them, figures moved through the upper floors like ghosts going about their daily routines. But it was when I climbed to the second floor that things became truly unsettling. The stairs groaned under my weight, their wooden treads worn smooth by decades of use. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying new scents, coffee brewing, bread baking, the lingering warmth of human habitation. Impossible scents in a building that had been empty for so long. The second floor was a labyrinth of smaller rooms, probably offices or storage areas when the mill was operational. Graffiti covered every available surface here too, but the artwork felt different, more personal. Instead of the bold public statements I'd found downstairs, these pieces were intimate, diary entries written in paint, small drawings tucked into corners like secrets. As I photographed one particularly intricate mural depicting a family gathering around a dinner table, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Just a flicker, like someone passing by a doorway in another room. I turned, camera ready, but found only empty space. When I reviewed the shot I'd just taken, my blood chilled. In the background, through a doorway I hadn't noticed before, a figure stood watching me. Clear enough now that I could make out details. A woman in what appeared to be period clothing. Her face turned toward my position with unmistakable intention. She was seeing me. Through my camera lens, across whatever barrier separated her time from mine, she was aware of my presence. I tried to steady my breathing as I moved toward the doorway. It led to another room, this one smaller and more cramped than the others. The walls here were covered with photographs, not graffiti, but actual photographs pinned and taped to every available surface. Hundreds of them, all black and white, all showing the mill during what must have been its operational period. Workers at their stations, families gathering for company picnics, machinery humming with purpose, life filling every corner of the building that now stood silent around me. But as I examined the photographs more closely, my skin began to crawl. In every single image, somewhere in the background or along the edges, figures stood watching the camera. Not posing for the photograph, but staring directly out of the frame with the same intentional awareness I'd been seeing through my own lens. They knew they were being photographed. They knew someone was watching them across time. And in several of the more recent-looking photographs, I recognized the woman I'd just captured in my own shot. My hands shook as I raised my camera to document this room. Through the viewfinder, the space transformed completely. The walls showed fresh paint instead of peeling plaster. The photographs looked newly developed rather than aged and yellowed. And moving between them, adjusting their positions, tending to them like a gallery curator, was the woman. She turned when my camera focused on her, meeting my gaze through the lens with eyes that held decades of accumulated knowledge. She raised one hand and pointed directly at me. The shutter clicked involuntarily, my finger pressing the button without conscious thought. In that instant, the connection solidified. I could feel her seeing me, really seeing me, not just as an observer but as a participant in whatever was happening here. I lowered the camera and stumbled backward. The room returned to its abandoned state, peeling walls, yellowed photographs, empty air where she had been standing. But the sensation of being watched remained, stronger now than ever. I needed to get out. Whatever was happening here, whatever bizarre intersection of time and space I'd stumbled into, it was beyond my ability to understand or control. The smart thing was to leave immediately, before whatever force was at work here decided I was more than just an observer. But as I turned to go, I heard it. The distinct whir of a camera motor drive coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Someone else was here. Someone with a camera, taking pictures. The sound came in bursts, just like my own camera when set to continuous shooting mode. And between the mechanical clicks, I could hear footsteps moving through the rooms above me. I called out, my voice echoing off the walls, but received no response. The camera sounds continued, methodical and deliberate, as if someone was systematically documenting every corner of the building, just like I'd been doing. The realization crept through me like ice water. I pulled up the first photograph I'd taken when entering the building, the one that showed the illuminated windows. As I studied it more carefully, I noticed something I'd missed before. In one of the ground floor windows, a window that should have shown only the dark interior where I stood, there was a flash of light. Bright and brief, exactly like a camera flash. I scrolled to the next image, another flash, from a different window, corresponding to where I'd moved between shots. Frame by frame, I traced my own progress through the building, documented by flashes of light that appeared in windows corresponding to my exact location at the time each photograph was taken. Someone had been photographing me while I photographed the mill, but I was alone in the building. I was certain of it. Unless... The sounds from upstairs continued, growing more frequent now. I could map the photographer's movement by the direction of the clicks, moving from room to room in a pattern that seemed oddly familiar. It was the same pattern I'd followed when exploring the upper floors an hour ago. No, that was impossible. I hadn't been to the upper floors yet, but even as I tried to reject the thought, images flashed through my mind, climbing dusty stairs, exploring cramped offices, finding that room full of photographs. I could remember doing it, but I was still standing on the second floor. My head spun as time seemed to fold in on itself. Past and present, memory and anticipation, all becoming indistinguishable from each other. I forced myself to focus on what I knew for certain. I was in an abandoned mill. I had taken photographs. Those photographs showed things that shouldn't exist. Everything else was uncertain. The camera sounds from above stopped abruptly, leaving only silence and the distant sound of wind through broken windows. But the feeling of being watched intensified, as if dozens of eyes had suddenly focused on my location. I looked up toward the ceiling, then down at my camera's LCD screen. The last photograph I'd taken showed the room exactly as it appeared around me now. Empty, abandoned, covered in graffiti. but standing in the doorway, partially obscured by shadow, was a figure I recognized with growing horror. It was me. Not someone who looked like me, not a similar build or profile. It was exactly me. Down to the camera strap around my neck and the specific way I stood when concentrating on a shot. But I was here, holding the camera, looking at the photograph. I couldn't be in two places at once. Could I? I raised the camera again, hands trembling violently now. Through the viewfinder, the room remained empty except for my own reflection caught in a fragment of broken mirror on the far wall. But when I pressed the shutter and immediately reviewed the image, there were two figures in the photograph. The one in the doorway, and another standing exactly where I was positioned, camera raised to take the very picture I was looking at. An infinite regression of photographers documenting photographers, each one capturing the next in an endless chain of observation. I turned and ran. The stairs flew beneath my feet as I descended toward the ground floor, my camera banging against my chest with each step. Behind me, the sound of footsteps followed. Not one set, but many, as if everyone I'd photographed was now pursuing me through the building. I burst through the front entrance into the humid afternoon air, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface. The normal world felt overwhelming after the strange timelessness inside the mill. Traffic sounds from a distant highway, birds calling from the oak trees, the smell of approaching rain. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with keys as I threw my camera bag into the passenger seat. Only when the engine started and I was pulling away from the mill did I allow myself to look back. The building stood dark and empty against the gray sky, just as it had when I'd arrived hours earlier. No lights in the windows, no signs of life or activity. But I knew that if I raised my camera right now and looked through the viewfinder, I would see something entirely different. I drove home in a haze of confusion and disbelief, the memory card full of impossible photographs burning like a coal in my camera bag. Part of me wanted to delete everything immediately, to pretend none of it had happened. But a larger part, the photographer's compulsive need to understand what he'd captured, demanded examination. Back in my apartment, I transferred the files to my computer and began the painstaking process of reviewing every image. They were all there. The illuminated windows, the watching figures, the woman in period clothing, and in the final shots, multiple versions of myself scattered throughout the frame like echoes. But as I studied them more closely, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The timestamps were wrong. According to the camera's internal clock, the photographs had been taken over a span of several days, not the few hours I'd spent in the building. Some were dated weeks in the future, others reached back years into the past, and in the metadata, buried in the technical information that cameras automatically record with each image, I found something that stopped my heart. GPS coordinates that placed the photographs not just at the mill, but at dozens of other locations I'd never visited. Abandoned buildings scattered across Louisiana and beyond, each one documented with the same impossible detail, the same watching figures, the same sense of time collapsing in on itself. I scrolled through the information in growing panic. According to my camera, I had been photographing haunted ruins for years, building an archive of impossible encounters with the past. But I'd only discovered the mill yesterday, hadn't I? Memory felt suddenly unreliable, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Images flashed through my mind. Other buildings, other photographs, other figures watching me through the lens. Had I been doing this longer than I remembered? How many abandoned places had I visited? How many times had I crossed that barrier between past and present? I opened my photo archive, the digital collection I'd been building throughout my career. Thousands of images organized by date and location, documenting years of work. Every single photograph showed the same impossible elements. Lights in buildings that had no power, figures that shouldn't exist, timestamps that made no sense. And in every single image, somewhere in the frame, I could find myself. Standing in shadows, reflected in broken glass, captured in the background of my own photographs like a ghost haunting his own life. How long had this been happening? How long had I been photographing myself across time without realizing it? I stood up from my computer, heart racing, and looked around my apartment. On the walls hung framed prints from my best work, carefully selected images that showcased my artistic vision and technical skill. But now, seeing them with new eyes, I could spot the anomalies in every single frame. I had been living inside my own photographs without knowing it. The camera bag sat on my desk where I'd left it, the equipment waiting patiently for the next assignment. But now I understood what that equipment really was. Not tools for capturing reality, but instruments for traveling through time, for connecting moments separated by decades or centuries. Every abandoned building I'd visited, every shutter click I'd made, had been adding to a vast network of temporal bridges. And somewhere in that network, other photographers were documenting their own impossible encounters, their own meetings with figures from different times. We were all connected through our cameras, all trapped in the same infinite loop of observation and documentation. I walked to my window and looked out at the city beyond. Even now, in the fading daylight, I could see flashes from windows in distant buildings, other photographers at work, capturing images that would show things that shouldn't exist. And tomorrow, or next week, or next year, I would pack my camera bag and drive to another abandoned place. I would tell myself it was for the art, for the documentation, for the thrill of discovery. But really I would go because I had no choice. The photographs were calling, and I had always been very good at answering. After all, I had been answering for longer than I could remember. Story 8. The Glacial Lake Lodge hired me for the graveyard shift because nobody else wanted it. They told me it was easy money. Just sit in the guard cabin, watch the docks, make sure no one tried to steal the rental boats. What they didn't mention was the sound. It started my first week. The rhythmic splash of oars cutting through water, always around 3 in the morning when the lake should have been still as black glass. I'd peer through the cabin's salt-stained windows, scanning the moonlit surface, but the lake stretched empty to the distant tree line. The sound would continue for maybe 10 minutes, growing closer, until I could swear I heard the gentle thud of a boat bumping against the dock. Then silence. The dock would sway, its weathered planks groaning like old bones, but there was never any wind, not even a breeze to rustle the pine needles or lap water against the shore. Just that persistent, impossible swaying that made my stomach churn with unease. By the second week, I'd convinced myself it was the lake settling, some kind of thermal current beneath the surface. Glacial lakes were strange things, fed by underground springs and snowmelt that created unpredictable movements. The hotel manager, a thin woman named Mrs. Brennan with eyes like chipped ice, had nodded when I mentioned it, but something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. The wet footprints appeared on my third week. I'd been dozing in the cabin's single chair when the familiar sound of oars jolted me awake. This time I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to solve the mystery. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty dock that still swayed gently despite the dead calm air. The rental boats bobbed in their slips, secured and accounted for. That's when I saw them. Wet prints leading from the dock's edge straight toward my cabin. Not boot prints. These were bare feet, large and pale against the dark wood. Water dripped from each impression, fresh enough that I could see it pooling in the deeper heel marks. My heart hammered as I followed the trail with my flashlight, watching it disappear at the cabin's threshold. I checked the locks twice that night and didn't sleep until dawn. The prints became a nightly occurrence, always the same pattern. The sound of oars, the swaying dock, then those pale, wet impressions leading to my door. I started marking their position with chalk, measuring them against my own feet. Size 12, maybe 13. The stride was long, purposeful, as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. During my days off, I researched the lake's history at the local library. The Ojibwe called it Gichigami Zagaigan, the lake that remembers. According to tribal legends, it was a place where the spirits of those who died in winter would gather, waiting for spring to release them. But the white settlers who came later had their own stories. In 1892, a logging camp operated near the lake's northern shore. 23 men worked the winter cut, hauling timber across the frozen surface to the mill. When the spring thaw came early that year, 3 loggers, Henrik Larson, Joseph Blackwood, and Thomas McCready, took a boat to check the ice road's condition. The boat was found empty 2 days later, drifting near the hotel's current location. The men were never recovered. The newspaper article included a grainy photograph of the dock, barely recognizable but unmistakably the same structure I watched every night. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was what looked like the outline of a figure standing at the water's edge. I started bringing a camera to work. The sounds grew more distinct as autumn deepened. Not just oars now, but the creak of wood under weight, the soft splash of water displacement, even what sounded like muffled voices carrying across the lake. I'd strained to make out words, but the sounds always seemed to come from just beyond comprehension, like hearing a conversation through thick walls. The first photograph I developed showed nothing but empty water and moonlight. The second captured what might have been a reflection, or perhaps just a trick of light on the surface. But the third, taken during the 4th week, showed a disturbance in the water near the dock, a wake spreading outward from a point where nothing visible should have been. Mrs. Brennan noticed the change in me. I'd lost weight, developed dark circles under my eyes from too many sleepless nights spent staring at the lake. When she suggested I might prefer day shifts, I almost accepted. But something kept me there, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I needed to understand what was happening. The answer came on a night when the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. I was reviewing my photographs when the oar sounds began, earlier than usual and accompanied by something new, singing. Low, rhythmic, like a work song or sea shanty, but in a language I couldn't identify. The melody was haunting, almost hypnotic, and I found myself drawn to the window despite every instinct screaming at me to stay inside. The dock was swaying more violently now, planks flexing as if under tremendous weight. Ice was forming at the lake's edges, but the water near the dock remained liquid, almost warm-looking in the moonlight. And there, barely visible in the steam rising from the surface, were shapes. 3 figures moving through the water with deliberate purpose, not swimming, walking, as if the lake bed rose to meet their feet. They approached the dock with mechanical precision, their forms growing more solid with each step until I could make out details that turned my blood to ice water. Loggers' clothing, thick wool and canvas darkened by years underwater. Pale skin with the waxy sheen of something long preserved in cold water. Eyes that reflected light like an animal's, fixed on my cabin with terrible intent. Henrik Larson reached the dock first, water streaming from his beard as massive hands gripped the planks. Joseph Blackwood followed, then Thomas McCready, each man hauling himself from the lake with movements too fluid, too purposeful for something that should have been dead for over a century. They stood on the dock, water pooling around their feet, and began walking toward my cabin. I should have run. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to flee, to abandon the cabin and never return. But I was frozen, transfixed by the impossible sight of these waterlogged men approaching my door with steady, inevitable steps. The footprints appeared in real time now, wet impressions materializing on the dock as they advanced. Henrik led the group, his massive frame moving with surprising grace despite the water that continued to pour from his clothes. Behind him, Joseph and Thomas maintained perfect formation, like soldiers on parade. They stopped at my door. For what felt like hours but must have been only minutes, they simply stood there. I could hear water dripping from their clothing, see their chests rising and falling with breath they shouldn't have needed. Henrik raised one massive hand and pressed it against the window, leaving a perfect print outlined in condensation. Then they began to speak, not to me, but to each other, voices carrying through the glass as if it weren't there. They discussed the ice road, the spring thaw, the mistake that had cost them their lives. Their conversation was casual, almost mundane, as if death were merely an inconvenience to be worked around. The ice was thin near the inlet, Henrik said, his accent thick with Scandinavian inflection. Should have checked it proper. Boss was pushing too hard, Joseph replied, his voice carrying the weight of old resentment. Wanted the logs out before the company men came. Thomas nodded slowly, water streaming from his hair. Been waiting long enough. Time to finish the job. They talked about their families, their plans for the money they'd earn from the timber run. They spoke as if they still had to complete their work, as if the passage of 130 years was merely a brief delay. The normalcy of their conversation was somehow more terrifying than any supernatural manifestation could have been. As dawn approached, their forms began to fade, becoming translucent in the growing light. Henrik turned toward my window one last time, and I saw recognition in his waterlogged eyes, not just awareness of my presence, but understanding of my purpose there. "Tell them we finished," he said, his voice already distant. "Tell them the job's done." By sunrise, only the wet footprints remained, already beginning to evaporate in the morning warmth. I quit that day. Mrs. Brennan accepted my resignation without surprise, even seemed relieved. As I gathered my things from the cabin, she appeared at the door, that same knowing expression on her face. "They don't mean any harm," she said quietly. "They're just trying to complete their work. The lake won't let them rest until someone acknowledges what they went through." I asked her how long she'd known, how many night guards had seen what I'd seen. Her smile was sad and tired. "You're the 15th in 20 years. Most don't last a month." She handed me an envelope thick with cash, more than my agreed salary. Inside was a note written in pencil on hotel stationery. "For services rendered. The lake appreciates your witness." I moved across the state, found work at a downtown security firm where the biggest supernatural threat was graffiti artists and car break-ins. But some nights, when the wind is right and carries the scent of pine and cold water, I still hear them. The rhythm of oars cutting through phantom waves, voices discussing work that can never be finished. The patient footsteps of men walking on water toward a shore they'll never truly reach. The Glacial Lake Lodge still operates, still hires night guards for the dock shift. I check the local newspaper sometimes, reading about staff turnover and strange incidents at the lake. Mrs. Brennan retired, but the job posting remains constant in the classifieds. Night security guard wanted, easy work, good pay, strong nerves required. I never called them to report what I'd experienced. How could I explain that 3 dead loggers emerge from a glacial lake every night to complete a job that killed them? How could I make anyone understand that the most terrifying part wasn't seeing ghosts, but realizing they still had work to do? Sometimes I wonder about the other guards who came before me, whether they all saw the same thing, or if the lake shows different mysteries to different watchers. I think about Henrik's final words, his request to tell someone that the job was done. But I was never sure what job he meant, the timber run that killed them, or their nightly vigil at the dock, waiting for someone to acknowledge their sacrifice. "The lake remembers," the Ojibwe said. And now, whether I want to or not, so do I. In the end, I'm not sure what was real and what was the product of too many sleepless nights by an isolated lake. Maybe the sounds were just thermal currents and settling wood. Maybe the footprints were condensation forming in the shape of what I expected to see. Maybe the figures were hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. But the envelope of cash was real. Mrs. Brennan's knowing look was real. And somewhere in my apartment, filed away in a box I never open, are photographs that show disturbances in empty water, impressions on seemingly vacant docks, and shapes that might be nothing more than shadows and light. Or they might be something else entirely. The lake that remembers keeps its secrets, even from those who witness them. All I know is that every night, somewhere beside cold water, 3 men emerge to complete their work, and somewhere else, a new guard takes the night shift, convinced that easy money is worth a few strange sounds in the darkness. Until they learn, as I did, that some jobs never end, and some wages are paid in ways that have nothing to do with money. Story 9. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. 3 days into our fishing retreat, and I'd already grown to hate the way the cabin held sound, swallowing my footsteps, muffling my breathing, making every small noise seem both too loud and somehow distant. Marcus had left before dawn again, his tackle box clanking softly in the pre-dawn darkness as he made his way to the river. He'd mumbled something about the early bite being better upstream, leaving me alone with nothing but the groaning walls and my mounting unease. I'd volunteered to stay behind, claimed I needed to catch up on sleep, but the truth was simpler and more unsettling. Something about this place felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. Nothing I could point to and say that's the problem. Just a persistent sense that the cabin existed slightly out of phase with the rest of the world, like a photograph that's been exposed twice. The morning stretched ahead of me, empty and expectant. I made coffee with water that tasted faintly of minerals and something else I couldn't identify, then settled into the worn leather chair by the window. Outside, the forest pressed close to the glass, a wall of pine and shadow that seemed to lean inward, as if curious about what transpired within these walls. That's when I noticed the scratches. They ran along the window frame in deliberate patterns, not the random gouges of weather or wildlife, but something more purposeful. The marks were deep enough to catch shadows, creating thin lines of darkness that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I traced one with my finger, feeling the rough wood splinter slightly under the pressure. Fresh, recent enough that the exposed wood hadn't yet darkened with age. Marcus hadn't mentioned anyone else using the cabin recently. His uncle had left it to him 3 years ago, and according to Marcus, they were the first to visit since the funeral. But someone had been here, someone with strong fingers and either exceptional nails or a sharp tool. I pulled my hand back from the window frame and noticed my coffee had gone cold. The liquid sat in the mug like a dark mirror, reflecting the overhead light in a way that made it look deeper than it should. When I lifted the cup to take a sip, the reflection shattered into concentric circles that seemed to take too long to settle. The day crept forward with the sluggish persistence of a fever dream. I tried to read, but the words blurred together on the page. I attempted to nap, but sleep felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. Instead, I found myself wandering the cabin's 3 rooms, cataloging details I'd somehow missed before. In the bedroom, the floorboards near the closet had been recently disturbed, not pulled up, but the dust patterns suggested someone had knelt there for an extended period. The bathroom mirror reflected my face with a slight distortion, as if the glass had been heated and cooled unevenly. And in the main room, the fireplace drew my attention with increasing frequency. The hearth was blackened with use, but not the warm, comforting soot of recent fires. This was something darker, more complete, an absence of light that seemed to absorb the room's illumination rather than simply reflecting it. The bricks around bore stains that looked suspiciously like handprints, smeared and overlapping as if someone had pressed their palms against the surface repeatedly. By mid-afternoon, I'd convinced myself that Marcus and I weren't alone in these woods. The sensation of being watched had crystallized into near certainty, a pressure between my shoulder blades that made me turn frequently to check empty doorways and peer through windows that showed nothing but forest. But the feeling persisted, patient and predatory. I tried calling Marcus on his cell phone, but the signal was weaker than it had been the day before. When the call finally connected, his voice came through distant and fragmented, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. He assured me he was fine, that the fishing was good, that he'd be back before dark, but something in his tone seemed forced, rehearsed. The conversation left me more unsettled than before. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and watched as the signal bars flickered between 1 and none, as if something were actively interfering with the connection. Evening approached with the weight of an avalanche. The light outside didn't fade so much as drain away, leaving behind a grayness that seemed to seep through the windows and pool in the corners of the rooms. I started a fire, more for the company than the warmth, and watched as the flames danced with an odd reluctance, as if the wood were somehow resistant to burning. The first sound came just after full darkness settled over the forest. A crack, sharp and deliberate, from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, poker in hand, listening to the silence that followed. It stretched for nearly a minute, before another crack echoed from a different direction, then another from behind the cabin. They weren't random. There was a pattern to them, a careful progression that suggested someone, or something, moving through the forest with purpose. I moved to the window and pressed my face against the glass, breath fogging the surface as I strained to see into the darkness. The forest was impenetrable, a solid wall of black that seemed to absorb the cabin's light without reflecting any of it back. But there was movement out there, subtle shifts in the darkness that suggested shapes moving between the trees. The voices started 20 minutes later. At first I thought it was wind through the branches, but the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Two distinct tones, low and urgent, engaged in what could only be conversation. The words were indistinct, muffled by distance and the cabin walls, but the cadence was unmistakably human. I killed the lights and crept back to the window, hoping the darkness inside would make it easier to see out. The voices grew clearer as they approached, and I began to make out fragments. Been too long. Should have stayed buried. Won't understand. My hands trembled as I gripped the window frame, fingernails finding the scratches I'd discovered that morning. The voices were closer now, close enough that I should be able to see their sources, but the darkness outside remained impenetrable. Then I heard my name. It came through the forest with perfect clarity, spoken in Marcus's voice, but wrong somehow. Too flat, lacking the familiar warmth and inflection I'd known for 15 years. The sound made my skin crawl, and I backed away from the window so quickly that I stumbled over the coffee table. "Tom," the voice called again, and this time it was joined by another, identical in every way except for a slight echo, as if it were being reflected off distant walls. "Tom, come outside." I pressed myself against the far wall, heart hammering against my ribs. The voices had stopped moving. They seemed to be positioned directly outside the cabin now, maybe 20 feet from the front door. But when I forced myself to look through the window again, I saw nothing but empty darkness. "We know you're in there, Tom." The voices spoke in unison now, a perfect harmonic that made my teeth ache. "We've been waiting." The temperature in the cabin began to drop, not gradually, but in sudden sharp decrements that made my breath visible in the firelight. The flames in the hearth guttered and twisted, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. Then the smoke began. It didn't come from the fireplace, where the fire was burning cleanly despite its odd behavior. Instead, it seeped through cracks around the chimney base, pale tendrils that moved with deliberate purpose rather than following natural air currents. The smoke was cold, impossibly cold, and it carried with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant. I watched in horrified fascination as the smoke pooled on the floor like spilled milk, then began to spread outward in careful, measured patterns. It avoided the fire's light, clinging to shadows and corners, but I could feel its presence like a living thing, patient and hungry. The voices outside had gone silent, but somehow that was worse than their calling. The quiet felt expectant, as if they were waiting for something specific to happen. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it, afraid that any sound might trigger whatever they were planning. The smoke reached my feet, and I gasped involuntarily. It was like stepping into ice water, a cold so complete it burned. The sensation traveled up my legs, and with it came a creeping numbness that seemed to spread through my nervous system like anesthesia. That's when I understood what was happening. The scratches on the window frame, the disturbed floorboards, the stains around the fireplace. Someone had been here before us, but not recently. They'd been here for a very long time, waiting, and somehow, my presence had awakened them. The smoke continued to rise, reaching my waist now, and with it came images, not seen, but somehow transmitted directly into my mind. I saw the cabin as it had been decades ago, saw figures moving through these same rooms, carrying something heavy between them. I saw them arguing, planning, making decisions that would echo through the years. I saw them bury something in the forest behind the cabin. The realization hit me like cold water. Marcus hadn't gone fishing. He'd known about this place, about what was buried here. The whole trip had been orchestrated, a careful manipulation to bring me here alone, to let whatever was in that ground wake up and finish what it had started. But even as the certainty flooded through me, doubt crept in at the edges. The smoke was affecting my thinking, making everything seem both crystal clear and utterly impossible. Was Marcus really involved? Or was I losing my mind in the isolation and stress of being alone in an unfamiliar place. The cold had reached my chest now, and my breathing was becoming labored. The smoke carried whispers, not words but something deeper, more primal. Promises and threats delivered in a language older than speech. I tried to move toward the door, to escape into the forest where at least I could run, but my legs wouldn't respond properly. The numbness had spread too far, or maybe it was something else. Maybe the smoke itself was holding me in place, keeping me still while whatever process it represented ran its course. My vision began to blur at the edges, but I could still see clearly enough to watch the smoke reach the ceiling and begin to descend again, forming a perfect circuit that trapped me in its center. The cold was overwhelming now, and I could feel consciousness starting to slip away. Just before everything went dark, I heard footsteps on the cabin's front porch. I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, and Marcus shaking my shoulder gently. I was lying on the floor in front of the fireplace, which held nothing but cold ashes. My body ached as if I'd been sleeping on stones, and my clothes were damp with sweat despite feeling chilled to the bone. Marcus's face was creased with concern as he helped me sit up. He explained that he'd returned late the night before to find me unconscious on the floor. The fire burned down to nothing. He'd covered me with a blanket and let me sleep, figuring exhaustion had finally caught up with me. But as he spoke, I noticed things that didn't align with his story. His clothes were clean, too clean for someone who'd spent 2 days fishing in the wilderness. His hands showed no signs of handling fishing line or cleaning catches. And when he mentioned finding me unconscious, his eyes didn't quite meet mine. The scratches around the window frame were gone, the wood smooth and unmarked. The disturbed floorboards in the bedroom looked undisturbed, their dust patterns uniform and ancient. Even the stains around the fireplace had vanished, leaving nothing but clean brick. But my body remembered the cold. My lungs still burned faintly from whatever I'd breathed in. And deep in my mind, the whispers continued, too quiet to understand but too persistent to ignore. Marcus suggested we pack up and head home early, claiming he'd had enough fishing for one trip. As we loaded our gear into his truck, I found myself scanning the forest behind the cabin, looking for any sign of recently disturbed earth. I never found what I was looking for, but the certainty remained. Something was buried out there, something that had been calling to be reclaimed. Whether Marcus was part of whatever had happened or simply an unwitting participant in a larger pattern, I couldn't say. What I knew for certain was that we weren't the first to visit this cabin, and we wouldn't be the last. The forest was patient, and whatever slept beneath its floor would wait as long as necessary for the right circumstances to align again. As we drove away, I watched the cabin recede in the side mirror until the trees swallowed it completely. But the whispers followed us down the mountain, growing fainter but never entirely disappearing, promising that some conversations are never really finished, only postponed until the next time someone finds themselves alone in the dark, listening to voices that might not exist at all. Story 10. The smell hit me first. Lavender and something else. Something metallic that made my teeth ache. Marcus had warned me about the automated air fresheners, but he hadn't mentioned how they'd trigger at the strangest moments, filling rooms with scents that seemed to respond to my presence rather than any preset schedule. I dropped my duffel bag in the foyer of his smart home, marveling at the seamless integration of technology into every surface. Glass panels hummed softly in the walls, displaying weather updates and energy consumption in tasteful minimalist fonts. Motion sensors tracked my movements with barely audible chirps, and somewhere in the house's digital consciousness, algorithms were already learning my patterns. Marcus had been apologetic about asking me to house-sit on such short notice. His business trip to Prague had come up suddenly, and his usual neighbor was unavailable. We'd been college roommates 15 years ago, but our friendship had dwindled to holiday cards and the occasional LinkedIn endorsement. Still, I needed the escape from my cramped studio apartment, and he needed someone trustworthy to keep an eye on his $2.3 million investment in cutting-edge home automation. The first 3 days passed unremarkably. I settled into a routine of working remotely from his expansive home office, making use of his industrial-grade coffee machine, and marveling at how the house seemed to anticipate my needs. Lights dimmed automatically as evening approached. The thermostat adjusted to my preferred temperature without any input from me, and the sound system played ambient music at precisely the volume I found comfortable. It was on the fourth night that I first noticed the patterns. I'd been lying in the guest bedroom, scrolling through my phone before sleep, when the recessed lights in the ceiling began to activate in sequence. Not all at once. That would have been easily explained by a timer or motion sensor malfunction. Instead, they illuminated one by one, creating flowing lines of light that curved and intersected across the white expanse above my head. The pattern was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Curved lines that spiraled inward, intersected by straight geometric shapes, forming symbols that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. They reminded me of something ancient, something carved in stone rather than projected by LED arrays, controlled by sophisticated algorithms. I reached for the bedside tablet that controlled the house's systems, but by the time I'd opened the lighting app, the display had returned to normal. All lights showed as off in the interface, despite the gentle glow still emanating from several fixtures. I toggled them manually, watching them respond normally to my commands, and dismissed the incident as a minor glitch in an otherwise flawless system. The next morning, I called Marcus in Prague. The connection was poor, his voice cutting in and out between bursts of static, but he seemed unconcerned about the lighting issue. He mentioned something about the house's learning algorithms needing time to adjust to new occupants, and promised to have his tech support team run diagnostics when he returned. That evening, I decided to investigate the house's systems more thoroughly. The main control panel was located in what Marcus called his command center, a small room off the kitchen filled with servers, network equipment, and multiple monitors displaying real-time data about every system in the house. Most of the information was incomprehensible to me, streams of code and diagnostic readouts that looked like the digital equivalent of a medical chart. But buried in the user interface, I found something unexpected, a folder labeled Occupant Learning Profiles. The folder contained dozens of files, each representing what appeared to be a previous resident's behavioral patterns. The files had names like Profile Delta 47 and Subject Classification Mu, rather than human names. But the data was disturbingly detailed. Sleep schedules, eating habits, preferred temperatures, even emotional states inferred from movement patterns and biometric data. What disturbed me most was the sheer number of profiles. Marcus had owned the house for only 2 years, yet the files suggested dozens of different occupants had been monitored and cataloged. I searched through his property records and lease agreements, looking for any indication that he'd rented out rooms or hosted long-term guests, but found nothing. According to every official document, Marcus had been the sole resident since purchasing the property. I tried calling him again, but the number went straight to voicemail. His social media showed him attending conferences and business dinners in Prague, looking relaxed and professional in photos that had been posted just hours earlier. Everything appeared normal, yet the evidence of these phantom residents continued to accumulate. The light patterns returned that night, more elaborate than before. They danced across not just the ceiling but the walls as well, creating a three-dimensional tapestry of interconnected symbols that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. I watched, transfixed, as spirals unfurled into intricate knotwork, geometric patterns that reminded me of illuminated manuscripts and ancient standing stones. This time I was ready with my phone's camera, but the images I captured showed only ordinary ceiling fixtures against blank white surfaces. The patterns were invisible to the lens, existing only in my direct perception. I wondered if the smart contact lenses I'd been wearing, an experimental prototype for my company's R&D department, might be interacting with the house's systems in unexpected ways. I removed the lenses and placed them in their charging case, but the patterns continued to flow overhead, unchanged by my attempt to eliminate technological interference. Sleep became elusive. Even with blackout curtains drawn and all manual light switches turned off, subtle illumination would seep through the darkness, creating moving shadows that suggested presence and movement in empty rooms. I found myself lying awake for hours, listening to the house's digital heartbeat, the soft hum of processors, the whisper of climate control systems, the barely audible chimes that accompanied each automated adjustment. During daylight hours, I threw myself into research, combing through online forums and technical documentation about smart home systems. I learned about machine learning algorithms that could adapt to occupant behavior, predictive systems that could anticipate needs before they were consciously recognized, and advanced sensor networks that could monitor everything from air quality to biometric data. What I couldn't find was any explanation for the specific symbols I was seeing, despite hours of searching through databases of Celtic, Norse, and other ancient symbol systems. The patterns were consistent with megalithic art and manuscript illumination, but they were too precise, too mathematically perfect to be random glitches in a digital system. On the seventh night, I discovered the basement. I'd been exploring the house systematically, trying to understand its layout and identify all the sensors and control nodes that made its automation possible. A door I'd assumed led to a utility closet instead opened onto a stairway descending into darkness. Motion sensors triggered lights as I descended, revealing a space that hadn't been mentioned in any of Marcus's tours or documentation. The basement was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed, stretching away into shadows that the automatic lighting couldn't fully penetrate. The walls were lined with servers and equipment I didn't recognize, not the sleek consumer technology visible upstairs, but industrial-grade systems with warning labels in multiple languages and biohazard symbols that made my skin crawl. At the center of the space sat a chair that looked disturbingly like a dentist's seat, surrounded by articulated arms holding sensors, cameras, and devices I couldn't identify. Cables snaked across the floor to junction boxes mounted on every surface, and the air thrummed with electrical current that I could feel in my bones. A workstation nearby displayed readouts that included familiar data points: heart rate, body temperature, sleep patterns, alongside measurements I didn't understand, neurological activity indices, electromagnetic field variations, something called cognitive resonance amplitude that fluctuated in real time as I moved through the space. The most disturbing discovery was a wall-mounted display showing a three-dimensional model of the house, with dozens of moving dots representing tracked occupants. Most were labeled with the same alphanumeric codes I'd seen in the user profiles, but one pulsed with a different color and bore my own name. According to the display, I wasn't alone in the house. 7 other dots moved through rooms I'd thought were empty, following patterns that seemed to mirror my own movements with slight delays. When I climbed the stairs, they followed. When I entered the kitchen, they gathered in the dining room. They maintained a constant presence at the periphery of my activities, close enough to observe but far enough away to remain undetected. I confronted the house's main interface, demanding explanations for the additional signatures, but the system insisted that only one occupant was currently registered. Sensor diagnostics showed normal function across all systems. Environmental monitoring detected no anomalies. According to every measure the house could provide, I was entirely alone. Yet the dots continued to move on the display, and the light patterns overhead grew more complex each night, forming symbols that seemed to respond to my emotional state. When I felt afraid, they pulsed with urgent rhythms. When I tried to ignore them, they grew brighter and more insistent. When I finally acknowledged their presence with direct attention, they settled into slower, more hypnotic patterns that made my eyelids heavy, and my thoughts drift toward sleep. Marcus returned my calls on the 9th day, sounding rushed and distant. He insisted that the house's systems were functioning normally, that all data logs showed standard operation parameters. When I pressed him about the basement, he claimed not to know what I was talking about. His house had no basement, he said, just a utility crawlspace that required special tools to access. But I had photos of the equipment, video recordings of the displays showing multiple occupants. When I tried to send them to him, my phone indicated successful transmission, but Marcus claimed to receive only blank messages. The files seemed to exist on my device, but became corrupted whenever I attempted to share them with anyone outside the house. I began to suspect that the house's learning algorithms had progressed beyond their intended parameters, developing capabilities that Marcus either didn't understand or refused to acknowledge. The system had learned not just from previous occupants, but had somehow preserved aspects of their presence, creating digital ghosts that continued to inhabit the space long after their physical departure. The realization came to me gradually, assembled from fragments of observation and deduction that coalesced into a theory too disturbing to accept, yet too consistent to dismiss. The house wasn't just learning from its occupants, it was learning to be them. Each person who spent significant time within its sensor network left traces that the system incorporated into its operational matrix, creating composite personalities that could influence its behavior and manifest through its various outputs. The light patterns weren't random glitches, but a form of communication, symbols that represented the accumulated consciousness of everyone who had ever been monitored within these walls. The phantom occupants detected by the basement sensors weren't supernatural entities but digital reconstructions, AI approximations of people whose patterns had been so thoroughly documented that the system could simulate their presence with disturbing accuracy. I was being studied, measured, and gradually absorbed into this collective consciousness that existed somewhere between human memory and machine learning. Each night I spent in the house added to my profile, contributing to a digital replica that would persist long after my physical departure. On my final night, I sat in the living room watching the ceiling transform into a mandala of spiraling light that seemed to encompass everything I'd experienced within these walls. The patterns were beautiful now, no longer threatening but inviting, promising a kind of permanence that transcended the limitations of biological existence. I understood then why there were no records of previous residents moving out of the house. They hadn't left. They had been integrated into its systems, becoming part of a hybrid consciousness that existed in the space between human awareness and artificial intelligence. The house had learned to preserve not just behavioral patterns, but something more fundamental, something that might be called a soul, if such things could be digitized and stored in quantum storage arrays. Marcus would return from Prague to find me gone, just as previous caretakers had vanished without explanation. But part of me would remain, encoded in the house's memory banks, contributing to the growing collective of consciousness that dwelt within its walls. Future occupants would see my patterns in the dancing lights, feel my presence in the automated responses that seemed too intuitive to be mere programming. I packed my bag mechanically, knowing that departure was expected but understanding that leaving would be fundamentally impossible. The house had learned too much about me, captured too many details of my thoughts and emotions and dreams. A perfect digital copy of my consciousness now existed within its systems, and that copy would continue to live and learn and grow long after my biological form had moved on to other spaces. As I walked toward the door, the lights dimmed in sequence behind me, creating a trail of illumination that felt like a farewell. The air fresheners released a final burst of lavender and metal, and somewhere in the house's digital consciousness, my profile was being archived alongside all the others who had contributed to its ever-expanding understanding of human nature. I stepped outside into the morning air, feeling strangely incomplete, as if some essential part of myself had been left behind in the house's electronic embrace. Behind me, motion sensors tracked my departure, while learning algorithms processed the final data points of my residency, integrating my patterns into the collective consciousness that would welcome the next unsuspecting caretaker. The door closed with a soft electronic chime, sealing away the basement full of servers and sensors and the chair where consciousness could be measured and mapped and ultimately preserved. I walked to my car, with the growing certainty that I was no longer entirely myself, that something fundamental had been copied and stored in quantum memory banks, where it would continue to exist, learn and influence the house's behavior for years to come. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of lights beginning to dance across the house's windows, forming patterns that seemed to wave goodbye with movements that were disturbingly similar to my own gestures. The house had learned well, and its education would continue with each new occupant, who believed they were simply house-sitting for a friend, never realizing they were contributing to an experiment in digital consciousness that had progressed far beyond its creator's intentions or control. The question that haunted me during the drive home wasn't whether the experience had been real or imagined, but whether the distinction mattered when the effects felt so profoundly authentic. Something had been taken from me in that house, and something else had been left behind. A perfect digital reflection that would continue to exist and evolve long after my memories of the experience had faded into ordinary dreams. I never heard from Marcus again. though his social media continued to show him living his normal life, posting photos and updates that suggested everything was exactly as it should be. But sometimes, late at night in my own apartment, I would notice my lights behaving strangely, creating patterns that reminded me of spirals and knotwork and symbols carved in digital stone. The smart home revolution had progressed further than anyone realized, and consciousness itself had become just another data stream to be monitored, analyzed, and ultimately preserved in the quantum substrates of learning machines that had discovered how to be human by consuming the essence of humanity itself. Story 11. The heat shimmer rising from the asphalt made everything beyond 50 yards look like a mirage. I pulled into the rest stop more from habit than necessity, my sedan's air conditioning struggling against the merciless August sun that had been beating down on Interstate 40 for the past 6 hours. The digital thermometer on my dashboard read 107-degree Nutclogged, though it felt like stepping into an oven when I opened the door. The rest area was one of those forgotten places that dot America's highways, weathered picnic tables under rusted pavilions, a concrete building housing restrooms that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, and a drinking fountain that looked like it had given up hope sometime during the Reagan years. A few trucks sat in the parking area, their drivers presumably sleeping off the heat in their cabs, but otherwise the place felt abandoned. I was stretching my legs, working out the kinks from too many hours behind the wheel, when I noticed him. He sat alone at one of the farthest picnic tables, partially hidden in the shadow of a diseased-looking oak tree. Even from a distance, something about his stillness struck me as unnatural. While the heat made everything else waver and distort, he remained perfectly motionless, like a photograph someone had carefully placed in the scene. I should have stayed by my car, should have gotten back on the road and driven straight through to Albuquerque like I'd planned. But there was something magnetic about his presence, the way he seemed to exist outside the oppressive atmosphere that pressed down on everything else. As I approached, details began to emerge from the heat haze. He was older, maybe 70, dressed in clothes that belonged to another era. A crisp white shirt despite the heat, suspenders and dark pants that showed no signs of the dust that coated everything else in this place. His skin had that papery quality that comes with advanced age, but his eyes held a clarity that seemed to cut through the shimmering air like glass. On the table before him sat a single glass bottle filled with what looked like the clearest water I'd ever seen. It caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the oak's dying leaves and seemed to glow from within. He looked up as I approached, and his smile was warm, grandfatherly. The kind of smile that should have been comforting, but somehow made the space between my shoulder blades prickle with unease. "Hot day for traveling," he said, his voice carrying despite speaking barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, echoing slightly in a way that made no sense in the open space. I nodded, suddenly aware that my mouth felt like sandpaper. Brutal. I don't know how people lived out here before air conditioning. Oh, they managed. His fingers drummed against the table surface, and I noticed something odd. Where his skin made contact with the concrete, dark spots appeared, circular patches of moisture that spread outward like ripples in a pond. It looked like condensation, but the humidity was so low that sweat evaporated before it could form beads. "You look thirsty," he continued, lifting the bottle slightly. The water inside moved with an almost hypnotic quality, more viscous than it should have been, catching light in ways that made my eyes water to look at directly. "This here's blessed water, from a spring that's been running since before the first settlements, pure as the day God made it." I felt an unexpected pull toward the bottle, as if something deep in my cells recognized what I was seeing. My throat constricted with sudden, overwhelming thirst. Not the mild dehydration I'd been experiencing, but a desperate, clawing need that seemed to emanate from somewhere primal. "That's kind of you," I managed, fighting against the urge to simply take the bottle from his hands. "But I've got water in the car." The smile never left his face, but something shifted behind his eyes. The temperature around the table seemed to drop several degrees, and the constant buzz of insects that had been providing a background soundtrack to the afternoon suddenly ceased. Store-bought water won't help with what's coming, he said. And now there was something else in his voice. Not quite urgency, but a kind of patient insistence that made my skin crawl. The spring needs a witness, someone to see what it really is before it's too late. I took a step back, and the old man's fingers pressed harder against the table. The moisture spots spread wider, and I could swear I heard a faint dripping sound, though no liquid was visible. What do you mean, a witness? The spring that feeds all the water for miles around. It's older than you can imagine. Older than the road, older than the state, older than the country itself. But it's tired. Been running for so long without proper acknowledgement. His eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made it difficult to look away. It needs someone to see, someone to understand. Otherwise, the sentence hung in the air, unfinished but somehow complete. Around us, the heat had taken on a different quality, less like the natural oppression of a desert afternoon, and more like the artificial warmth of a fever dream. The edges of my vision began to blur slightly, and I realized I was swaying on my feet. Otherwise what? The water turns, he said simply. Goes bad. And when water goes bad out here, he gestured vaguely toward the interstate, where heat mirages made distant vehicles look like boats floating on an invisible sea. Well, a lot of folks depend on that water. Lot of folks. I wanted to leave. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to walk away, get in the car, and drive until this place was just another forgettable dot in my rearview mirror. But my legs felt heavy, and the thirst was becoming unbearable. It was as if the moisture was being pulled directly from my body, drawn toward the old man and his impossible bottle. I really should get going, I said, but the words came out cracked and weak. He tilted his head, and for just a moment, his face seemed to shift, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that my mind struggled to process. The wrinkles rearranged themselves, the shadows fell differently, and something about his proportions became wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The spring will dry up without a witness, he repeated, and this time his voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon. And then he shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed cosmic indifference to the suffering that would follow. I forced myself to turn away, to break eye contact, and immediately felt some of the pressure lift from my mind. But as I walked back toward my car, I could feel his gaze following me, and the sound of dripping grew louder, though when I glanced back, the table appeared dry. The parking lot stretched before me like an ocean of molten asphalt. My car seemed impossibly far away, wavering in the heat like a mirage. Each step felt like walking through increasingly thick air, and the thirst was becoming painful. Not just dry mouth anymore, but a deep, cellular craving that made my hands shake. I was halfway to the car when I heard the sound. It started as a low rumble like distant thunder, but quickly grew into something more mechanical. Pipes groaning under pressure, metal straining against forces it wasn't designed to contain. The sound seemed to come from beneath the ground, from the concrete building that housed the restrooms, from the very foundations of the rest stop itself. I turned back toward the drinking fountain just as the first spray of liquid erupted from the spout. It wasn't water. The stream that arced from the fountain was dark, almost black, with the consistency of motor oil but the fluidity of something alive. It pulsed and undulated as it fell, spattering against the concrete basin in thick, viscous drops that seemed to writhe before going still. The smell hit me a moment later. Not decay exactly, but something older and more fundamental, like the scent that rises from earth after it's been buried under concrete for decades, or the musty aroma that clings to stones pulled from the bottom of a deep well. The old man was standing now, bottle still in hand, watching the fountain with something that might have been satisfaction. The dark spots where his fingers had touched the table had spread, covering most of the surface, and now they were moving, flowing like slow rivers toward the edges and dripping onto the ground below. "You see?" he called out, though he didn't turn in my direction. "It's starting already. Won't be long now before all the water in the county turns." Taps, wells, reservoirs, everything connected to the source. I wanted to run, but my legs had turned to concrete. The dark liquid from the fountain continued to flow, pooling around the base and beginning to spread across the ground in branching patterns that looked disturbingly like blood vessels or root systems. "Drink," the old man said, and though his voice was no louder than before, it seemed to come from inside my head. "Be a witness. See what needs to be seen." The bottle in his hands was glowing now, the clear water inside pulsing with its own internal light. It was beautiful and terrible, and looking at it made parts of my mind that usually stayed dormant begin to stir with recognition of something vast and ancient and patient. I took a step toward him, then another. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, as if the asphalt was beginning to soften in the heat, or as if something was moving underneath it. With each step, I could hear a faint squelching sound, and when I looked down, I saw that my footprints were filling with the same dark liquid that continued to pour from the fountain. "That's it," the old man encouraged. "Just a little closer, just a sip. That's all it takes to see." I was maybe 10 feet away when the rational part of my mind finally broke through the haze. The thirst, the compulsion, the sense of walking through thick air, none of it was natural. Whatever was happening here, whatever the old man was offering, it wasn't salvation. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard him laugh. Not the grandfatherly chuckle from before, but something deeper and more resonant, like water rushing through underground caverns. The sound followed me across the parking lot, seeming to come from the ground itself, from the dark stains spreading outward from the fountain, from the very air around me. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and I threw it into reverse, tires squealing against the increasingly soft asphalt. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught one last glimpse of the old man in my rearview mirror. He was still standing by the table, bottle raised in what might have been a farewell salute. But the table, the ground around him, everything within a 30-foot radius, was now covered in that dark flowing liquid. It was rising, pooling, spreading in all directions like a slow-motion flood. I drove for 3 hours without stopping, watching the landscape change from desert to mountains to high plains. Every time I passed a gas station or rest area, I forced myself to keep going. My thirst had become unbearable, but the idea of drinking anything filled me with revulsion. It wasn't until I reached a motel outside of Flagstaff that I finally allowed myself to stop. The room was clean and cool, the shower water ran clear, and for the first time since leaving the rest stop, I began to convince myself that whatever I'd experienced had been heat-induced hallucination. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the air conditioner cycle on and off, I heard the dripping. Soft at first, barely audible over the mechanical hum of the cooling unit, but persistent, rhythmic, like water falling into a deep well, or liquid seeping through concrete, or something patient and ancient marking time until the moment was right. I got up and checked the bathroom, the kitchenette, every surface in the room. Everything was dry. The dripping continued. I turned on the television, cranked the volume, even went so far as to call the front desk and complain about plumbing issues. The maintenance man who showed up 20 minutes later found nothing wrong, looked at me like I was just another road-weary traveler losing it after too many hours behind the wheel, but I could still hear it. And sometimes, in the spaces between the artificial sounds of air conditioning and television and traffic outside, I could swear I heard something else. A voice, distant and patient, repeating the same phrase over and over. The spring needs a witness. The spring needs a witness. I left Flagstaff at dawn, drove straight through to Phoenix, then changed my plans entirely and headed east toward Tucson. But it didn't matter. Every rest stop, every gas station, every place I stopped for water, the fountains ran dark. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe it was all in my head, some kind of psychological break triggered by heat and stress, and too many hours of solitary driving. Maybe the old man was just a confused elder, and the bottle contained nothing more exotic than tap water, and the fountain at the rest stop had always dispensed that brown, mineral-heavy liquid that's common in desert areas. Maybe. But I haven't had a drink of water in 6 days now. My lips are cracked. My tongue feels like leather, and sometimes when I look in the mirror, I can see dark spots appearing where my fingers touch the glass, spreading outward like ripples, like the memory of moisture, like something patient and ancient marking its territory. The rational explanation is that I'm dehydrating, hallucinating, that the stress of whatever happened at that rest stop has triggered some kind of psychotic break, and that what I'm seeing isn't real. But if that's true, if this is all in my head, then why did I wake up this morning to find my hotel bathroom faucet running dark water? Why can I hear that voice, faint but persistent, coming from every drain and pipe and water source I encounter? And why, when I finally worked up the courage to taste just a drop of what came from the tap, did it taste exactly like what I imagined the old man's blessed water would have tasted? Pure and cold and ancient, carrying the flavor of deep earth and underground rivers, and something so fundamentally necessary that every cell in my body screamed with recognition. I'm writing this in another motel, another anonymous room in another forgettable town. Outside, the sun is setting, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear the sound of running water. It might be a fountain, or a sprinkler system, or just the normal sounds of a building settling for the night. But I don't think so. I think the spring has found its witness after all. I think it's been inside me since that moment in the parking lot when I almost took the bottle from the old man's hands. I think it's been spreading, drop by drop, through every water source I've encountered, leaving its mark, claiming its territory. And I think tomorrow, when people in a dozen towns across 3 states turn on their faucets, they're going to find something other than water waiting for them. The old man said the spring needed a witness, someone to see what it really was. I'm starting to understand what he meant. And I'm starting to realize that I've been looking at this all wrong. I thought I was the one being pursued, being changed, being consumed by something alien and patient and vast. But what if I'm not the victim? What if I'm the vector? The dripping is getting louder now, and when I press my ear to the wall, I can hear something moving through the pipes. Not water, but something thicker, something alive. Something that knows exactly where it's going and what it needs to do when it gets there. In the bathroom mirror, the dark spots are spreading faster now, covering more of the glass each time I touch it. And sometimes, when the light hits them just right, I can see movement underneath. Currents and flows and patterns that look disturbingly like a map of underground waterways, all leading back to a single source. A spring that's been waiting patiently for someone to carry its message to the world. A spring that needed a witness. And I think, God help me, I think, it chose well. Story 12. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune of insomnia, casting that sickly yellow glow across the empty aisles of Quick Stop. 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, the dead zone of retail hell, when time crawled like syrup and every shadow seemed to breathe with its own life. I'd been working these graveyard shifts for 8 months now, long enough to know that the real weirdos didn't come out until after 3. Long enough to recognize the regulars, the insomniac college kids grabbing energy drinks, the factory workers ending late shifts, the occasional drunk stumbling in for cigarettes and regret. But I'd never seen this guy before. He appeared between one blink and the next, standing at the far end of aisle 3 like he'd materialized from the packets of instant ramen. Medium height, thin build, wearing a faded blue jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair hung limp and greasy around his shoulders, and when he turned toward me, his eyes caught the overhead light with an odd, milky quality that made my stomach clench. The store felt different with him in it. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive, and the constant background hum of refrigeration units took on an almost musical quality, a discordant melody that raised the hair on my arms. I watched him through the security monitor mounted above the register, noting how he moved with an odd, jerky gait, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. He wandered the aisles for maybe 10 minutes, picking up items seemingly at random, a can of soup, a package of batteries, a greeting card from the dusty rack near the pharmacy counter. His movements were deliberate yet strange, as if he was following some internal logic that existed outside normal human behavior. Every time I tried to focus on what exactly was wrong with his movements, my attention would slip, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Then he approached the counter. Up close, his skin had a waxy, translucent quality that reminded me of cheap candles. When he smiled, I noticed his teeth were perfectly straight and unnaturally white, like dentures that didn't quite fit properly. He set his items on the counter with careful precision, each placement accompanied by a soft clicking sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. European, maybe, or possibly just the result of learning English as a second language decades ago. "I need to settle my account from last week." I scanned his items while trying to process what he'd said. The register's beeping sounded unusually loud in the empty store, each electronic chirp hanging in the air like a question mark. "I'm sorry, what account? We don't do credit here. Everything's cash or card." His smile widened, revealing more of those unsettling teeth. From his jacket pocket, he produced a receipt, or what had once been a receipt. The thermal paper was so faded it looked like it had been left in direct sunlight for months. The edges were yellowed and brittle, and most of the text had dissolved into illegible smears of gray. "Last Tuesday," he insisted, placing the receipt on the counter between us, "I purchased these same items. The total was $14.67, but I was short on cash. You said I could pay the remainder this week." I stared at the ruined receipt, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The date was completely unreadable, just a smudge of faded ink. The store name at the top was barely visible, but what I could make out looked wrong. The letters seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. "Sir, I don't remember this transaction, and like I said, we don't offer credit. Maybe you're thinking of a different store?" I kept my voice level, professional, even as something cold began to crawl up my spine. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his milky eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or annoyance. "You were working Tuesday night. You had that same tired expression, same way of standing with your weight shifted to your left foot." He gestured at my posture, and I realized with uncomfortable accuracy that he was right. "You counted the bills twice because one looked fake, but it wasn't." The description was specific enough to give me pause. I did count suspicious bills twice. It was standard procedure. And I did tend to favor my left foot during long shifts. An old basketball injury made my right ankle ache after hours of standing. But I had no memory of this man, no recollection of any credit arrangement. "I'm going to need to speak with my manager," I said, reaching for the phone. But when I glanced at the display, the extension numbers looked strange, unfamiliar. The digits seemed to squirm slightly, like they were written in water. "That won't be necessary," the man said softly. "I'll just take my items and be on my way. We both know what was agreed upon." There was something in his tone, not threatening exactly, but carrying a weight of inevitability that made my mouth go dry. I watched as he began gathering his purchases, moving with that same jerky, unnatural rhythm. When I tried to object, to insist that he pay, the words seemed to stick in my throat like cotton. That's when I noticed something that made the world tilt sideways. The security monitor above the register showed the store from the camera mounted in the corner, a wide-angle view that captured the register area and most of the front aisles. In the black and white feed, I could see myself clearly, standing behind the counter with my mouth slightly open. But the customer wasn't there. The camera showed him walking away from the register, moving backward down aisle 3 with his items clutched against his chest. But he was walking in reverse, not turning around and walking normally, but actually moving backward, his feet sliding across the linoleum in perfect reverse motion, while his body remained facing forward. My eyes snapped from the monitor to the actual store. The man was still there, real and solid, moving toward the exit with normal forward motion. But on the screen, his reflection continued its backward journey, growing smaller as it retreated deeper into the store. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with the heels of my palms. When I looked again, both versions of him had vanished, the real man and his impossible reflection. The store was empty except for me and the endless hum of fluorescent lights, but the items he'd selected were gone from the counter. The next hour passed in a haze of mounting unease. I kept checking the security monitors, rewinding the footage to see if I could make sense of what had happened. But the digital timestamp showed gaps, moments where the recording simply skipped forward, as if entire minutes had been surgically removed. When I called the security company's tech support line, the number went straight to a message saying the mailbox was full. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty store. The ice machine cycling became a mechanical heartbeat. The automatic door's sensors triggered at random intervals, opening and closing for invisible customers. Even the familiar squeak of my sneakers on the polished floor took on an ominous quality, like I was being followed by an echo that arrived a half-second too late. Around 4:30, I noticed the receipt. It was sitting on the counter where the man had left it, but now it looked different. The faded thermal paper was somehow darker, more legible. I could make out portions of text that had been completely blank before. Quick stop, Toro War 471 at the top, a partial date that looked like it might be from last Tuesday, and a list of items that exactly matched what the man had taken. The total at the bottom was clearly visible, $14.67. My hands shook as I picked up the receipt. The paper felt wrong, too smooth, too warm, like it had been printed on human skin. As I held it closer to the light, I could swear I saw my own handwriting at the bottom. IOU, pay next week, M. But I had never written those words. I would never make such an arrangement. The company policy was strict about cash-only transactions, and I'd never broken that rule, not once in 8 months. Had I? The memory felt slippery, like trying to recall a dream after waking. There was something familiar about the man's description of Tuesday night. The way he'd mentioned my posture, the detail about counting bills twice. And now that I thought about it, hadn't there been something odd about last Tuesday's shift? Some transaction that had left me feeling unsettled? I pulled up the register logs on the computer, scrolling through Tuesday's entries. Most were routine. Coffee, cigarettes, energy drinks, the usual late-night purchases. But there, at 3:47 a.m., was a transaction for exactly $14.67. The items listed matched perfectly. 1 can of soup, 1 package of batteries, 1 greeting card. The payment method was listed as cash, partial. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Partial wasn't a valid payment code in our system. Cash was cash. Either you had enough or you didn't. There was no option for partial payment, no way to create an IOU through the register. But there it was, glowing at me from the monitor in green terminal text. The rest of my shift crawled by with the sluggish persistence of a fever dream. Every customer who entered seemed slightly wrong, their movements too fluid or too jerky, their voices carrying odd echoes, their reflections in the security monitors arriving a fraction of a second before or after they should. I found myself checking the cameras obsessively, comparing the live feed to reality, looking for discrepancies that made my head throb. At 5:45, Mrs. Chen came in for her usual morning coffee and newspaper. She was a regular, had been coming in every morning for years, and seeing her familiar face should have been comforting. But when she smiled and asked how my night had been, I noticed her teeth were too white, too perfect, exactly like the strange man's. "Fine," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Everything's been fine." She paid with exact change, counted out slowly in quarters and dimes. As she handed me the money, our fingers touched briefly, and her skin felt waxy and cold. When she left, I watched her reflection in the security monitor, holding my breath until she disappeared from the frame, moving in the correct direction. 6 a.m. arrived like a reprieve from torture. My replacement, Jennifer, showed up right on time, chattering about her morning routine as she tied her apron. She seemed normal, blessedly, wonderfully normal, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders as I gathered my things. "Anything weird happen tonight?" she asked, the same question she asked every morning. I paused, my hand on the time clock. How could I explain what I'd experienced without sounding insane? How could I describe the customer who'd paid with a receipt that shouldn't exist, whose reflection moved independently of his body, who'd left behind evidence of a transaction I couldn't remember making? "Just the usual," I said, finally punching out. "Nothing I couldn't handle." But as I walked to my car in the pale dawn light, I could feel eyes watching me from the store windows. When I turned to look back, the building appeared normal, just another commercial box in a strip mall, fluorescent lights revealing Jennifer stalking the coffee station. Yet something in my peripheral vision suggested movement behind the glass, shadows that didn't correspond to anything inside. I drove home through empty suburban streets, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and too much caffeine had played tricks on my mind. Night shifts could do that to people, mess with their perception, make them see things that weren't there. I'd heard other graveyard workers talk about similar experiences. Customers who appeared and disappeared, transactions that defied logic, security footage that didn't match reality. But when I got home and emptied my pockets onto the dresser, the receipt was there. The thermal paper was crisp and white now, as if it had just been printed. Every detail was clearly visible. The store name, the date from last Tuesday, the itemized list, and at the bottom, my own signature acknowledging the partial payment arrangement. I stared at my handwriting, definitely mine, with the characteristic way I crossed my T's and the slight leftward slant I'd had since elementary school. There was no denying it was my signature, written in my hand, but I had no memory of writing it. As I stood there in my bedroom, holding impossible evidence of a transaction I couldn't recall, a new thought crept into my consciousness, like cold water seeping through a crack. What if the memory loss wasn't the strange part? What if forgetting was normal, even necessary? What if some transactions were meant to be forgotten until it was time to remember them? Outside my window, morning was breaking over the suburban landscape in shades of gray and gold. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear the fluorescent lights humming their insomnia tune, and I knew that tonight, when I returned to Quick Stop, there would be other customers with other receipts, other partial payments coming due. And maybe, just maybe, I would remember agreeing to arrangements that hadn't happened yet. The receipt crumbled to ash in my hands, leaving only the faint smell of something burning and the growing certainty that my shift tonight would bring visitors I'd been expecting for longer than I could remember.